To the ones who walk the familiar roads with the echo of an unknown road in their hearts, to those who feel the hum of the unreal beneath the mundane, this book is offered. It is for the dreamers who believe their dreams have deserted them, for the seekers who sense a profound truth just beyond the veil of waking comprehension. May you find resonance in the rye fields of your own subconscious, in the hidden hollows where your sleeping selves reside, waiting for a forgotten lullaby to stir them. To those who understand that sometimes the most potent reality is not what we see, but what we feel, the faint, persistent thrumming of a life unlived, or perhaps still dreaming. This is for the fragments of ourselves that lie scattered, waiting for the quiet magic of reintegration, for the courage to face the stillness and hear the song that sleeps within. May your own internal lullabies find you, and may the dawn, when it comes, be a dawn of wholeness. The rye field had always been more than just a shortcut for Andre. It was a breathing entity, a verdant ocean that whispered secrets only the soil truly understood. Today, however, its whispers had amplified into a distinct, resonant hum. It wasn't the gentle rustle of wind through stalks, but a deep, visceral vibration that pulsed from the very heart of the earth, a sound that seemed to bypass his ears and settle directly into his bones. He felt it in the soles of his worn boots, a rhythmic thrumming that suggested an ancient, subterranean engine. The rye stalks themselves, usually obedient to the unseen currents of air, stood unnaturally still, their heads bowed as if in silent communion with this pervasive vibration. They didn't sway, they thrummed, their collective energy creating a palpable field of resonance that seemed to push against Andre as he stepped further into its embrace. He carried no memories of dreams, only the persistent, gnawing ache of their absence. It was a hollow space within him, a void where the vibrant tapestry of the subconscious should have been. This field, this uncanny expanse of golden grain, had become his daily passage, a familiar route etched into the muscle memory of his existence. Yet, with each step today, the familiarity warped, replaced by a growing sense of the uncanny. The air grew perceptibly thicker, pressing in on him like a velvet shroud. It resisted his passage, clinging to his skin, a tangible force that suggested the rye was more than just vegetation. It was a living, breathing presence, holding its breath in anticipation of something profound. The silence, paradoxically, was deafening, punctuated only by that insistent, earthbound hum. It was a silence pregnant with unspoken questions, a void that mirrored the one within his own mind. The very atmosphere of the field seemed to have shifted, imbued with a strange, expectant quietude that tightened the knot of unease in his stomach. The rye stalks, usually a uniform height, began to exhibit an unsettling variability in their growth. Some reached skyward with an almost aggressive vigor, their heads heavy with seed, while others, mere feet away, remained stunted, their stalks thin and almost sickly. This unevenness was not typical. It was a visible manifestation of the unnatural vitality that suffused the field, a chaotic surge of life that defied natural order. Andre found himself drawn to the taller stalks, their sheer density and height creating a tunnel-like effect as he walked. They formed verdant walls on either side, their heads brushing against each other with a dry, papery sound that, when combined with the deep hum, created a disorienting auditory landscape. He imagined the roots, intertwined and pulsing beneath the soil, drawing some unknown sustenance that propelled this aberrant growth. It was as if the earth itself was in a state of fever, its usual rhythmic pulse replaced by this erratic, powerful thrum. He remembered, or rather, he almost remembered, a time when the rye field was simply a field, a backdrop to a more ordinary existence. But that memory, like all others pertaining to his inner life, was hazy, shrouded in a fog he could not penetrate. The ache where dreams should reside was a constant companion, a dull throb that intensified in places like this, where the veil between the mundane and the extraordinary seemed to thin. The rye field was such a place. It was a threshold, a liminal space that existed on the edge of his conscious awareness, a territory he navigated by habit rather than by any true understanding. Today, that habit felt precarious, as if he were treading on ground that could shift and swallow him whole. The thrumming beneath his feet was a constant reminder of the field's inherent strangeness, a vibration that seemed to resonate with a deeper, more primal part of himself, a part he had long since forgotten. As he pushed deeper, the rye seemed to close in around him, its stalks growing taller, thicker, more insistent. The light filtering through the dense canopy of grain shifted from a clear, golden hue to something more diffused, more ethereal. It was as if the sun itself was struggling to penetrate the unnatural density of the field. Its rays diffused into a soft, milky luminescence. The air, already thick, now felt heavy with moisture, clinging to his clothes and skin. It carried a subtle, earthy scent, mingled with something else, something sweet and cloying, like overripe fruit or wilting flowers. This was not the scent of a healthy, sun-drenched field. It was the aroma of something decaying, or perhaps something growing with an unholy intensity, pushing beyond the boundaries of natural life. The thrumming continued, a low, persistent note that seemed to weave itself into the fabric of his thoughts. It was a lullaby of sorts, a forgotten melody sung by the earth itself, a song that resonated with a forgotten part of his being. He found himself unconsciously tapping his foot to the rhythm, his fingers drumming against his thigh. It was an involuntary response, a deep-seated echo of a connection he couldn't articulate. The rye stalks, in their unnatural stillness, seemed to lean in, their heads angled towards him, as if listening, as if absorbing the residual energy of this subterranean symphony. He felt a prickling sensation on his skin, a subtle awareness of being observed, not by eyes, but by a collective, vegetative consciousness. The path he followed, worn smooth by countless traversals, now seemed to shimmer and distort, as if viewed through heat haze. Yet, there was no heat. The air was cool, almost damp. It was a visual anomaly, a trick of the light, or perhaps a distortion in his own perception, brought on by the overwhelming sensory input of the field. The hum was a constant, a grounding force in this increasingly surreal landscape, yet it also served to further detach him from the familiar. He was a solitary figure in a sea of vibrating gold, a conscious entity navigating a space that felt profoundly alive, yet utterly alien. The thought, unbidden, surfaced. What if the field was dreaming him, as he was incapable of dreaming himself? He had reached a point where the rye was so tall, so dense, that the sky was almost entirely obscured. Only slivers of diffused light pierced the canopy, creating shifting patterns on the ground. The thrumming intensified, a palpable vibration that made the very air around him seem to shimmer. It was then that he noticed the subtle change in the ground beneath his feet. The well trodden path seemed to dip, to sink inwards, as if the earth had exhaled. It wasn't a sudden collapse, but a gradual, almost imperceptible depression, a subtle gathering of the land. He paused, his senses on high alert. This was new. He had walked this path countless times, and he would have noticed such a significant alteration. The hum seemed to coalesce around this depression, focusing its energy, drawing his attention. It was as if the field itself was highlighting this specific spot, drawing his gaze to a place that had previously been indistinguishable from the rest of the undulating terrain. The rye stalks surrounding this dip were even taller, their heads bowed lower, as if in reverence or in fear. They formed a more tightly packed circle. Their vibrant green deepened to an almost black hue in the dim light. A hush fell over the field, the pervasive thrumming momentarily receding, replaced by a profound, expectant stillness. The air here felt different, heavier, imbued with a silent, waiting presence. Andre approached the depression cautiously, his boots sinking slightly into the yielding earth. The scent here was stronger, the sweet, decaying aroma mingling with the damp, loamy smell of freshly turned soil. He knelt, his hands brushing against the cool, damp blades of rye. He could feel the vibration still, not as a broad pulse, but as a focused, rhythmic tremor emanating from directly beneath him. It was as if the heart of the field, the source of its unsettling vitality, was located here, in this hidden hollow. The rye stalks formed a natural curtain, obscuring whatever lay within the depression, adding to the sense of mystery and apprehension. He felt a pull, an irresistible curiosity urging him forward, a need to understand the source of this pervasive hum and the strange alteration in the landscape. The world outside this localized anomaly seemed to fade, the familiar contours of his usual reality dissolving in the face of this encroaching enigma. The rye field, in its unnatural growth, had revealed a secret, and Andre, the man without dreams, felt an inexplicable compulsion to uncover it. The further Andre pressed into the labyrinth of vibrating stalks, the more the familiar world above began to recede. It wasn't the descent of evening, nor the stark clarity of midday. Instead, the sky, once a boundless expanse of azure, began to soften, to blur at the edges like an old watercolor painting left too long in the rain. It bled into hues of bruised lavender and muted slate, a canvas prepared not for the dawn, but for a profound and unbroken slumber. The sun, or what he took to be its celestial counterpart, had ceased its ascent, arrested in a perpetual, languid twilight. It was a light that offered no warmth, no definitive direction, merely a diffused, ethereal glow that seeped through the densely packed rye, tinting the world in shades of unreality. This was no ordinary atmospheric shift. It was a fundamental alteration of the very medium through which he perceived existence, a visible manifestation of the uncanny hum that resonated through his very being. This ethereal dimness was more than a visual change. It was an atmosphere, a palpable presence that settled upon him with the weight of unremembered lullabies. The air, already thick with the cloying sweetness he had noticed earlier, now seemed to carry the faint, musky scent of undisturbed dust of forgotten rooms. It was the smell of suspended time, of moments held in amber. Andre felt as though he were wading through a sea of muted sensations. The vibrant colors of his waking world leached away, replaced by the subtler, more insidious tones of a mind lost in its own deep recesses. The rye stalks, no longer merely tall, now seemed to lean in, their tips brushing against this muted sky, merging with it, as if the boundary between the terrestrial and the celestial had dissolved. He found himself looking upwards with an increasing frequency, his neck craning to discern the familiar blue, only to be met with this endless expanse of twilight hues. It was a sky that had forgotten how to be bright, a sky suspended in a state of perpetual, heavy sleep. The contrast with the vibrating earth beneath his feet was jarring. The hum, a constant reminder of a potent, hidden energy, seemed at odds with the placid, muted ceiling above. It was as if the field were a vast, slumbering organism, its dreams manifesting as this peculiar sky, while its physical core pulsed with an unrestrained, vital force. The silence that accompanied this visual transformation was profound, a silence that was not an absence of sound, but a presence of stillness so absolute it felt like a tangible entity. The usual chirping of unseen insects, the distant call of birds, all were absent, swallowed by this pervasive, dreamlike quietude. The effect was deeply unsettling. It was not the comforting darkness of night, which promised rest and eventual renewal, nor the brilliant clarity of day, which offered purpose and direction. This was a neutral, indeterminate light, a visual limbo that mirrored the void within him, the absent landscape of his dreams. He felt a disorienting sense of disorientation, a loss of bearings that went beyond mere geography. The sky, usually the ultimate reference point, had become a source of confusion, its altered state a direct reflection of the unnatural reality he was now immersed in. He found himself questioning the very nature of perception. Was the sky truly changing, or was it his own internal landscape that was projecting these muted colors, this pervasive sense of drowsy inertia? The thought, unbidden and disquieting, lodged itself in his mind. Perhaps the field was not just humming, but dreaming, and its dream had tinted the very heavens. The transition was not abrupt, but a slow, insidious creep. One moment, he could still catch a hint of the familiar blue peeking through the rye. The next, that blue was gone, replaced by a soft, dusty violet that deepened into shades of lavender and gray. It was like watching a slow-motion erosion of the ordinary, a gradual surrender to an unseen, pervasive influence. The light felt heavy, dense, as if it had to push its way through layers of accumulated somnolence. Each ray, if it could be called that, was a languid caress rather than a sharp beam, spreading out thinly as if exhausted from its journey. The rye stalks themselves seemed to absorb this light, their green deepening, taking on a more saturated, almost velvety texture in the dimness. Andre stopped, the rhythmic thrumming beneath his feet, the only anchor in this shifting visual and atmospheric reality. He closed his eyes, trying to recall the sensation of a clear, unblemished sky, of a sun that burned with unadulterated power. The effort was like trying to grasp smoke. The memory was there, a faint impression, but the sensory details were blurred, as if viewed through layers of fine silk. When he opened his eyes again, the sky had shifted further. The lavender had deepened to a rich plum, and streaks of a pale, milky gray began to appear, like the first wisps of fog before a dawn that would never break. The air itself seemed to change in tandem with the sky. It grew cooler, not with the crisp chill of an approaching autumn evening, but with the damp, still coolness of a subterranean cavern. The sweet, decaying scent intensified, mingling with this new, damp earthiness. It was the smell of growth, yes, but of a growth that was unchecked, burgeoning in the absence of sunlight, nurtured by something deeper, something that pulsed with the very hum he felt. He imagined the roots of the rye, not reaching for the sun, but burrowing deeper into the earth, drawing sustenance from a hidden reservoir, their growth a direct response to this pervasive internal energy. He noticed, too, the subtle alteration in the density of the rye. The stalks here were not merely tall, they were impossibly so, forming a canopy so complete that only these diffused, twilight-colored streams of light managed to penetrate. The path, barely discernible before, was now almost swallowed by the encroaching grain. He felt a growing sense of isolation, a profound awareness of being alone in a space that was fundamentally divorced from the world he knew. The sky above was no longer a ceiling. It was a veil, a curtain drawn across the familiar, revealing a landscape born of something other than the sun and the wind. The thrumming seemed to respond to his stillness. It did not cease, but its rhythm deepened, becoming slower, more deliberate, like the heartbeat of a giant at rest. It was a sound that bypassed the ears entirely, resonating directly within his bones, within the very marrow. He felt it in his teeth, in the tips of his fingers, a constant, low-frequency vibration that spoke of immense, dormant power. This power, he suspected, was the source of the altered sky, the reason for the perpetual twilight. The field was not merely growing, it was breathing, dreaming, and its dream had suffused the heavens. He continued to walk, though the act felt less like deliberate movement and more like being carried along by an unseen current. The rye stalks brushed against him, their dry, papery texture a stark contrast to the damp, cool air. They were like silent sentinels, their heads bowed towards the muted sky, their collective existence bound to the thrumming heart of the earth. He imagined that if he were to reach out and touch them, he would feel the same vibration, a shared resonance that connected every stalk, every root to the source of this profound anomaly. The feeling of being observed intensified, not by any visible entity, but by the field itself. It was a passive, pervasive awareness, as if the entire expanse of rye was a single, vast consciousness absorbing his presence, cataloging his passage. There was no malice in this observation, no threat, only a deep, quiet acknowledgement. It was the gaze of something ancient, something that had existed long before him and would continue long after, its rhythms dictated by a force he could only dimly perceive. He found himself scanning the stalks for any deviation, any hint of what lay beyond this surreal sky. But they were uniform in their unnatural height. Their colors deepened to a rich, dark green in the diffused light. There were no breaks, no glimpses of anything beyond the confines of this golden green cathedral. The path ahead remained a suggestion, a worn impression in the earth, constantly threatened by the encroaching grain. He wondered if the path itself was a dream, a phantom line etched by the memory of those who had passed through before, a memory that was now being overwritten by the field's own unfolding narrative. The twilight deepened further, the plum hues giving way to almost indigo shades at the zenith. Yet there were no stars, no moon, only this unbroken expanse of sleeping color. It was a sky devoid of direction, a celestial map rewritten in the language of dreams. Andre felt a strange sense of inevitability, as if he were a character in a story already written, his path predetermined by the very hum that now vibrated through him. He was no longer simply walking through a field. He was traversing the landscape of a profound, collective slumber, a sky suspended in an eternal, dreamlike sleep, mirroring the void within his own unremembering mind. The deeper he went, the more he felt the world outside this field cease to exist, its reality a fading echo against the dominant, resonant pulse of the rye. The altered sky was not an anomaly, it was a declaration, a statement that the rules of the world had been suspended, and he had stepped across a threshold into a realm governed by sleep, by dreams, and by the silent earthbound hum. The bruised, twilight sky, no longer merely a diffusion of light, but a tangible presence, drew Andre's gaze downward. His feet, guided by a rhythm deeper than his own will, carried him through the impossibly tall stalks, their tips now a uniform, velvety darkness against the muted heavens. It was then, amidst the ceaseless, resonant hum that vibrated not just through the ground, but through the very marrow of his bones, that he perceived it, a subtle depression in the land, a gentle sagging of the earth that had, until this moment, been utterly concealed. It was a hollow, a scooped out indentation in the otherwise flat expanse of the rye field. The unnatural height of the stalks, which had so thoroughly blotted out the familiar contours of the landscape, had also conspired to hide this singular feature, rendering it invisible to any casual observer, or indeed to any observer rooted in the logic of the ordinary world. Andre stopped, the insistent thrumming beneath his soles momentarily seeming to pause, as if in acknowledgement of his discovery. He looked back the way he had come, trying to reconcile this sunken space with the field he remembered, the field of sun-drenched afternoons and the chirping chorus of unseen insects. He could not. This hollow felt new, or if not new, then newly revealed, as if the very fabric of reality had been rewoven to expose it. The feeling of fated discovery was overwhelming. It was not a random accident of topography, but a revelation, a consequence of the surreal, atmospheric shift that had enveloped him. The altered sky, with its perpetual twilight hues of bruised lavender and slate, seemed to have breathed this hollow into existence, or perhaps it had simply peeled back a veil that had previously rendered it imperceptible. He felt an undeniable pull, a magnetic attraction emanating from the dark, inviting mouth of the depression. It beckoned him, a silent promise of answers to the questions that had begun to coalesce in his mind, or perhaps a deeper descent into further, more profound mysteries. The hollow was not large, perhaps no wider than a farmer's cart, but its depth seemed to stretch into an impossible darkness. The rye stalks, as if respecting some unseen boundary, did not encroach upon its rim. They stood sentinel at its edge, their heads bowed as if in reverence, their densely packed forms creating an impenetrable screen around this singular breach in the uniformity of the field. The air within the hollow felt different, cooler, carrying a faint, earthy scent that was both ancient and strangely alive. It was the smell of undisturbed soil, of roots that had burrowed deep into the earth's embrace, and something else, something subtle and indefinable, like the ghost of a forgotten bloom. Andre took a tentative step forward, his boot sinking slightly into the yielding earth at the hollow's edge. The hum, which had been a constant, pervasive vibration, seemed to intensify here, focusing into a more concentrated thrumming that emanated from the very depths of the depression. It was as if the earth itself had a pulse, and this hollow was its beating heart. He crouched, peering into the darkness, the dim light of the perpetual twilight, diffused by the rye and the strange sky, barely penetrated the upper reaches of the hollow, casting long, indistinct shadows that danced and writhed with a life of their own. He reached out a hand, his fingers brushing against the rough, cool earth of the rim. It felt solid, real, a stark contrast to the disorienting unreality of the sky above. Yet, the very fact of its existence, its sudden revelation, spoke of a reality far more complex than he had ever imagined. The rye field, he realized, was not merely a crop, it was a guardian, a living, breathing entity that had, through some cosmic alignment, decided to reveal a hidden aspect of itself. This hollow was not an oversight. It was a deliberate unveiling, a testament to the profound, subterranean energies that pulsed beneath the surface. The silence that had so unnerved him earlier now seemed to deepen within the hollow, a pregnant silence that held the weight of untold stories. It was a silence that was not empty, but full of the unspoken histories of the earth, of the secrets whispered by the roots that delved into the darkness. He imagined this place as ancient, predating the field itself, a natural depression that had been woven into the fabric of this uncanny place. Perhaps it was a place where the veil between worlds was thin, where the earth's hidden hum could more readily manifest itself. He thought of the last time he had traversed this field, perhaps under the same sky, though he couldn't be certain. Had the hollow been there then, masked by the ordinary height of the rye, or had the shift in the heavens, this celestial bleeding of color, somehow altered the very topography of the land? The latter seemed more plausible, more in keeping with the pervasive sense of magical transformation that had settled upon him. The sky was not just changing, it was influencing, reshaping, revealing. A faint tremor ran through the ground, more pronounced than the general hum. It was a localized vibration, originating from directly beneath the hollow. It was as if something within the earth was stirring, responding to his presence, to the focused attention he was now giving this hidden place. The air grew colder, the earthy scent intensifying, carrying with it a new note, something sharp and metallic, like the tang of rain on dry stone, or the scent of ozone after a lightning strike. He felt a strange certainty that he was meant to find this hollow, that his journey through the field had been orchestrated, his path subtly nudged towards this specific point of revelation. It was a place that seemed to exist outside the normal passage of time, a pocket of stillness in the midst of the pervasive hum. He wondered if it was a source, a focal point of the energy that permeated the entire field. The thought sent a shiver down his spine, not of fear, but of profound anticipation. He withdrew his hand, his fingers tingling with a residual energy. The darkness within the hollow seemed to deepen, to coalesce, as if the absence of light was itself a tangible substance. He could hear nothing from within, no rustling of stalks, no scurrying of creatures, only the insistent, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to emanate from the very core of the earth. It was a sound that resonated with a deep, primal rhythm, a rhythm that felt both alien and intimately familiar, like a forgotten melody from the dawn of time. The sky above continued its slow, imperceptible shift, the lavender deepening to a rich, bruised violet streaked with veins of pale, milky gray. It was a sky that no longer offered any connection to the world he knew, a sky that had become an integral part of this hidden, resonant landscape. The hollow, nestled at the heart of this transformed domain, felt like the key, the unlocked secret that the field had been waiting to reveal. He knew, with a certainty that bypassed logic, that he had to descend. The answers, or the next stage of his bewildering journey, lay within that dark, beckoning mouth. He shifted his weight, preparing to take the first step into the unknown depths, into the heart of the rye field's hidden song. The hum seemed to surge, a welcoming resonance that pulsed in time with his own quickening heartbeat, drawing him further into its inscrutable embrace. The descent into the hollow was not a descent into darkness, but into a different kind of light. It was a muted, diffused glow, born not from the sky above, but from the very earth beneath. As Andre's knees met the cool, damp soil, his eyes adjusted to this subterranean luminescence, a pale shimmer that seemed to emanate from the depths of the depression. He edged forward, his movements slow and deliberate, the scent of rich, turned earth, now laced with a subtle, floral perfume, like lilies after a rain. The hum, which had been a resonant vibration, now took on a more defined quality, a low, sonorous drone that seemed to weave itself into the very fabric of his being. It was a sound that resonated with a deep, primordial lullaby, a melody that felt both achingly familiar and impossibly distant, a forgotten lullaby from a childhood he couldn't quite recall. Then he saw it, lying at the bottom of the hollow, nestled within a bed of soft, dark moss, was a figure. Andre froze, his breath catching in his throat. It was a man, lying on his back, eyes closed, a picture of absolute repose. But it was not just any man. As his eyes traced the familiar curve of the jaw, the set of the brow, the slightly parted lips, a terrifying, exhilarating recognition dawned. It was himself, an exact replica, as if a mirror had been placed not before him, but within him, revealing a parallel existence. The likeness was so profound, so absolute, that for a dizzying moment, Andre felt a terrifying dissociation, a sense that he was looking at his own soul, laid bare and slumbering. The sleeping figure was dressed in simple, homespun clothes, indistinguishable from his own. His limbs were relaxed, his hands resting open on his chest, palms upward, as if in peaceful surrender. There was no sign of struggle, no hint of distress, only a deep, undisturbed sleep. A faint, almost imperceptible humming emanated from the sleeping Andre, a delicate resonance that seemed to pulse in time with the deeper thrumming of the earth. This was the source, he realized, the heart of the mystery that had drawn him into this hollow. This sleeping counterpart was not merely a reflection, but a manifestation, a physical embodiment of something he had carried within him, perhaps unknowingly, for his entire life. The encounter was profoundly disorienting. Logic warred with an ancient, instinctual knowing. How could this be? Was this a dream bleeding into reality? Or had he stepped into a dream? The earth around the sleeping figure seemed to glow with a soft, internal light, casting an ethereal halo that further blurred the lines between the physical and the spectral. Andre reached out a trembling hand, his fingers hovering inches above the sleeping man's chest. He could feel a faint warmth radiating from him, a gentle pulse of life that was both his own and utterly separate. The hum intensified, weaving a complex tapestry of sound around him. It was no longer just a vibration, it was a song, a melody so deeply embedded in his subconscious that its conscious recognition felt like a homecoming. He strained to grasp the notes, to decipher the familiar cadence, but it eluded him, a phantom echo of a forgotten memory. This sleeping Andre, he understood, was the keeper of that lost melody, the repository of a song that his waking self could no longer consciously sing. He knelt beside the sleeping figure, his own body heavy with a weariness that was not his own, yet felt intimately familiar. He studied the peaceful expression on the sleeping face, the subtle rise and fall of his chest with each slow breath. There was a profound stillness about the figure, a quietude that seemed to absorb the very anxieties that had begun to stir within Andre. He felt an overwhelming urge to lie down beside him, to join him in this silent communion, to surrender to the same deep slumber. The implications of this discovery were staggering. This was not merely a hidden hollow in a rye field. It was a portal, a threshold into a deeper understanding of himself, or perhaps into a fractured self. The duality was both terrifying and strangely comforting. To find a part of oneself existing independently in a state of peaceful oblivion was a revelation that shattered his perception of identity. Was this his soul in repose, his spirit at rest, or was it a forgotten aspect of his being, a self that had been buried deep within the earth, waiting to be unearthed? He traced the contours of the sleeping face with his eyes, noticing the subtle lines of worry that were absent in this tranquil counterpart. His own life, he knew, was a constant stream of effort, of striving, of wrestling with the mundane and the extraordinary. This sleeping self, however, seemed to have transcended such struggles, existing in a state of pure, unadulterated peace. It was a peace he craved, a peace that seemed to radiate from the very stillness of the man lying before him. The hum now seemed to whisper forgotten names, fragments of lullabies, the murmur of ancient incantations. It was the sound of the earth dreaming, and this sleeping Andre was its central figure, its most cherished subject. Andre felt a strange sense of responsibility, a nascent guardianship over this slumbering replica. He was the one who had found him, the one who had disturbed his rest, however gently. He wondered if this sleeping self had always been here, a silent witness to the changing seasons, to the passage of time, to the growth of the rye that now concealed him. The air in the hollow was thick with a palpable sense of mystery, a potent brew of earth, floral perfume, and the intangible essence of a sleeping soul. Andre remained there, kneeling, his own consciousness becoming increasingly attuned to the subtle rhythms of this hidden space. He reached out again, his fingers finally brushing against the smooth, cool skin of the sleeping man's arm. It was real, solid, and yet it felt like a touch across a vast expanse, a connection to something both intimately familiar and impossibly alien. The hum continued, a constant, soothing presence that seemed to anchor him in this surreal landscape. It was the sound of the earth's quiet pulse, a rhythm that had always been there, he now understood, but one that he had never truly heard until now. This sleeping counterpart was not just a physical presence, he was a conduit, a living testament to the profound, hidden energies that permeated the rye field. He was the silent hum made manifest, the song of the earth embodied. Andre leaned closer, his ear near the sleeping man's lips. The hum was strongest here, a delicate vibration that seemed to emanate from within. It was a sound so soft, so pure, that it threatened to dissolve into the very air. He tried to replicate it, to hum along, but his own attempts sounded clumsy, discordant, a crude imitation of a celestial melody. This sleeping self was the true singer, the one who understood the language of the earth's deep heart. He sat back on his heels, a sense of wonder overwhelming him. This was not a threat, not an enemy, but a profound, inexplicable gift, a part of himself, delivered to him in the heart of a transformed rye field, under a sky that had forgotten the sun. The sleeping Andre was an enigma, a living paradox, a quiet testament to the unseen depths of existence. He was the silent counterpart to Andre's own restless journey, a still point in the turning world, a dream held captive by the earth. The hum continued, a gentle invitation, a promise of further revelations, as Andre remained in awe of the impossible sight before him. The mystery of the rye field had deepened, and in its heart he had found not an answer, but a profound and silent question in human form. He knew with a certainty that settled deep within his bones that this encounter was only the beginning. The sleeping counterpart held a key, a secret that the earth had entrusted to him, and the hum, that ever-present, ever-evolving song, was the soundtrack to his unfolding destiny. He felt a profound stillness descend upon him, a quiet acceptance of the surreal. The world outside this hollow seemed distant, irrelevant. Here, in this subterranean sanctuary, under the luminous glow of the earth, was the true center of his reality. The sleeping self was a profound mystery, and Andre understood that his path now lay in unraveling the riddle of this still, slumbering twin, a journey that would take him deeper into the heart of the rye field's hum, and perhaps deeper into himself than he had ever dared to venture. The scent of the lilies intensified, a sweet, haunting fragrance that seemed to whisper of secrets yet to be uncovered, of dreams yet to be understood. He was a silent observer, a witness to a profound and personal miracle, kneeling beside the sleeping echo of his own soul. The earth's pulse, the omnipresent hum, resonated with the quiet wonder that had overtaken him, binding him to this sacred, hidden space. The hum, which had been an abstract resonance, a disquieting vibration that seemed to emanate from the very marrow of the earth, now coalesced into something achingly familiar. It was a melody, faint at first, like the ghost of a sound on the edge of hearing, but undeniably present. As Andre knelt there, His gaze fixed on the impossibly still figure of himself, the notes began to resolve, weaving a tapestry of sound that tugged at the deepest, most inaccessible corners of his memory. It was the lullaby, the unsung lullaby his mother used to sing, a soft, repetitive cadence meant to soothe him into slumber during the long, hushed evenings of his childhood. He had forgotten, or rather, the conscious mind, with its incessant clamor of daily worries and obligations, had buried it so deep that it had become inaccessible, a lost treasure trodden underfoot by the passage of years. But here, in the luminous quiet of the hollow, cradled by the damp, perfumed earth, the lullaby was being resurrected. It wasn't merely a sound, it was a tangible sensation, a warmth that spread through his chest, unfurling like a forgotten bloom. The notes were simple, almost childlike, yet imbued with a profound tenderness that brought a sting to his eyes. Each phrase, each gentle rise and fall of the melody, was a direct conduit to a past he thought irrevocably lost. The sleeping figure, his mirror self lying in serene repose, was not just a physical replica, but a vessel, a profound vessel, containing not just his own sleeping form, but the slumbering essence of his forgotten memories, and at the very heart of it, this rediscovered lullaby. It was as if this other Andre, this earthbound twin, was the custodian of his past, the silent keeper of a trove of experiences and emotions that his waking self had long since misplaced. The melody seemed to emanate not just from the sleeping man's lips, but from the very soil around him, from the soft moss that cushioned his head, from the very air that circulated in this hidden depression. The hollow itself was singing, or rather, it was echoing the song that lay dormant within Andre. This was the emotional core of his predicament, the heart of the mystery that had drawn him through the whispering rye. It wasn't a physical quest, not an external threat or a tangible prize he was seeking. It was a journey into the self, a descent into the buried layers of his own history. The lullaby was the key, the sonic Rosetta Stone that promised to unlock the chambers of his forgotten childhood. He could feel the weight of all the unremembered moments, the lost conversations, the unspoken affections, all bound together by this single, potent melody. He closed his eyes, allowing the hum, now clearly the lullaby, to wash over him. He focused on the rise and fall, the gentle, undulating rhythm. He tried to recall the words, but they remained just out of reach, like fireflies flickering in the twilight. Yet, the feeling was potent. It was the feeling of safety, of being utterly and unconditionally loved. It was the feeling of a world that was simple, pure, and free from the complexities that had come to define his adult life. The lullaby was not just a song of childhood, it was a song of innocence, of a time before the world had imprinted its rough edges upon his soul. The implications were vast, and a peculiar sense of peace, interwoven with a thread of melancholy, began to settle within him. To discover that a part of oneself existed in such a state of peaceful oblivion, guarded by the earth, was a revelation. This sleeping Andre, breathing the earth-scented air, seemed untouched by the anxieties that had plagued Andre's waking hours. He was a testament to a stillness that Andre had only ever glimpsed in fleeting moments of profound exhaustion or deep introspection. This was more than just a physical manifestation. It was a spiritual one, a physical embodiment of his own forgotten inner landscape. The connection between the lullaby and this sleeping figure felt absolute. It was as if the melody was the very thread that bound them together, the invisible cord that tethered this dormant self to the living one. He imagined his mother singing this tune, her voice a gentle balm against the encroaching darkness of night. He could almost see her silhouette against the faint lamplight of their old home, her face etched with a soft, loving smile. These were not concrete memories, but spectral impressions, impressions brought to life by the resonating hum. The sound, he realized, was not a passive thing. It was an active force, a whisper from a forgotten era that resonated with the primal energies of the earth. The soil itself seemed to vibrate with the cadence of the lullaby, as if the very ground held the echoes of generations past, of all the mothers who had sung to their children, all the quiet moments of love and protection that had been shared under the vast, indifferent sky. The rye field, in its verdant expanse, was not just a passive backdrop. It was an active participant in this unfolding revelation, a sanctuary that had preserved this sacred resonance. He felt a profound sense of gratitude towards this silent counterpart. He was not a threat, nor a rival. He was a gift, a living echo of a time when Andre's world was smaller, simpler, and infinitely more secure. The lullaby was the evidence, the irrefutable proof of a connection that transcended the rational, the tangible. It was the sound of his own lost soul, a gentle, insistent call from a self that had been hidden away, waiting for the right moment, the right place, to be rediscovered. Andre continued to listen, to absorb the melody. He was no longer a passive observer, but an active participant in its reawakening. He began to hum along, tentatively at first, his own voice a rough, unpracticed echo of the pure, ethereal sound. But as he did, he felt a subtle shift within him. The dormant memories, stirred by the familiar tune, began to stir more vigorously. He felt a nascent tug at the edges of his awareness, a sense of something vast and significant on the cusp of emerging. The lullaby was not merely a relic of the past, it was a living entity capable of bridging the chasm between then and now. It was a reminder that even in the most forgotten corners of oneself, there existed a source of comfort, of love, of primal connection. The sleeping Andre was the living embodiment of that stillness, that peace, that unbroken continuity of being. He was the silent song made flesh, the lullaby given form and substance. He wondered if the sleeping figure would awaken when the lullaby reached its crescendo, if this reawakening of memory would trigger a corresponding awakening in the physical form. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. What would happen when the two Andes, the waking and the sleeping, the present and the past, finally converged? Would they merge into one, a complete and unified self? Or would their convergence unleash some unforeseen consequence, a disruption of the delicate balance that had been struck in this hidden hollow? The scent of lilies, which had seemed so ethereal moments before, now carried a deeper significance. They were the scent of remembrance, of purity, of a beauty that persisted even in the face of oblivion. They were the fragrant guardians of this sacred space, their perfume mingling with the earthy scent of the soil to create an atmosphere of profound, almost otherworldly sanctity. The lullaby, the lilies, the sleeping self, they were all interconnected, threads in a tapestry of self discovery that was far more intricate and profound than Andre could have ever imagined. He leaned closer to the sleeping figure, his own breath catching in his throat. The hum was a gentle whisper now, a soft caress against his eardrums. He felt an overwhelming desire to touch him, to bridge the final, physical gap between them. But he hesitated. There was a reverence in this moment, a recognition of something sacred that demanded a careful, deliberate approach. This was not a casual encounter. It was a communion, a dialogue between different facets of his own existence. The lullaby continued, a constant, comforting presence that anchored him in this surreal landscape. It was the sound of the earth's quiet pulse, a rhythm that had always been there, he now understood, but one that he had never truly heard until now. This sleeping counterpart was not just a physical presence, he was a conduit, a living testament to the profound, hidden energies that permeated the rye field. He was the silent hum made manifest, the song of the earth embodied. Andre remained there, kneeling, his own consciousness becoming increasingly attuned to the subtle rhythms of this hidden space. He reached out again, his fingers finally brushing against the smooth, cool skin of the sleeping man's arm. It was real, solid, and yet it felt like a touch across a vast expanse, a connection to something both intimately familiar and impossibly alien. The lullaby played on, a silent testament to the enduring power of memory, to the forgotten songs that shape our very being, and to the profound, mysterious depths that lie hidden within the human heart, waiting to be sung anew. The earth held its breath, and in the heart of the rye, a forgotten lullaby began to mend a fractured soul. The stillness of the hollow had been profound, an almost absolute absence of movement and sound, save for the re-emerging lullaby. Yet, as Andre continued to observe the figure lying before him, subtle recalibration of his understanding began. This was not merely a body in a state of deep slumber, a physical manifestation of his own unconsciousness. The realization dawned, not with a sudden flash, but with a creeping certainty that seeped into his bones like the damp chill of the earth itself. This was a consciousness at work, a dreaming consciousness, vibrant and active, existing in a state of perpetual, subterranean reverie. He had always considered his dreams to be fleeting, fragmented wisps that evaporated with the morning light, if they occurred at all. He'd often prided himself on a certain clarity of mind, a direct engagement with reality that left little room for the fanciful wanderings of sleep. But now, faced with this impossible tableau, he understood. His dreams, or rather, the dreams he believed he never had, were not lost. They were here. They were being lived, experienced, and woven into existence by this silent, earthbound counterpart. This was the hidden loom upon which the tapestry of his subconscious was being spun, a parallel reality unfolding beneath the sunlit world. The weight of this revelation pressed down on him, heavy and unyielding. It wasn't just a matter of misplaced sleep. It was a fundamental redefinition of self. If this dreaming figure was, in essence, a living repository of his unlived dreamscapes, then who was Andre, the one kneeling in the damp earth? Was he merely the observer, the conscious entity that oversaw the surface of existence, while this other self delved into the deeper, hidden currents of being? The earth, the very ground beneath his knees, seemed to vibrate with the unspoken question, echoing the nascent understanding within him. His identity, once a solid, unwavering edifice, now felt porous, permeable, a shell containing a vast, secret interiority. He watched the rise and fall of the sleeping Andre's chest, a slow, rhythmic breath that spoke of a life lived not in the crisp air above, but in the soft, fertile darkness below. The lullaby, still a gentle murmur, seemed to emanate not just from the lips of the sleeping man, but from the very soil that cradled him, as if the earth itself was breathing in time with his dreams. It was a profound and unsettling thought that his subconscious, his inner world, was not a personal, internal affair, but a shared experience, a communal dreaming conducted in the quiet womb of the planet. The implications were staggering. If his dreams were being manifested here, what form did they take? Were they grand epics, filled with fantastical creatures and impossible landscapes? Or were they the mundane anxieties of his waking life, played out in distorted, surreal iterations? The lullaby, with its tender, maternal melody, suggested a gentler, more primal substratum. It spoke of comfort, of safety, of a fundamental innocence that his waking self had long since shed. Perhaps then, this dreaming Andre was not wrestling with the demons of his daily grind, but rather reliving the pure, unadulterated moments of childhood, the ones that the conscious mind, in its relentless pursuit of progress and purpose, had deemed too trivial to retain. Andre felt a strange sort of envy, a pang of longing for this unburdened existence, to be, even in slumber, immersed in a world of simple melodies and unwavering maternal love, seemed a kind of salvation. His waking life was a constant negotiation with reality, a struggle against time and circumstance. This subterranean existence, however, appeared to be a sanctuary, a space where the laws of the external world held no sway, where the only imperative was the unfolding narrative of dreams. He tried to imagine the nature of these dreams. Was it a single, continuous narrative, or a series of disconnected vignettes? Did this sleeping self experience the passage of time as he did, or was it a fluid, amorphous experience where moments stretched into eternities and entire lifetimes could be compressed into a single breath? The lullaby offered no answers, only a soothing, persistent presence that seemed to anchor him, to provide a stable point of reference in this swirling vortex of newfound understanding. The scent of lilies, which had initially seemed a mere atmospheric detail, now took on a deeper resonance. Lilies were often associated with purity, with rebirth, with the fragile beauty of the ephemeral. Perhaps they were not just a passive element of this hidden space, but active participants in the dreaming consciousness, their fragrance weaving themselves into the very fabric of the dreams. It was as if the entire hollow was a carefully constructed stage, designed to nurture and amplify the subconscious, a silent, fertile ground for the germination of inner worlds. He considered the nature of consciousness itself. Had he always possessed this dual existence, a waking self and a dreaming self, orbiting each other in unseen spheres? Or was this a more recent phenomenon, a consequence of some unspoken shift in his being, a splitting of the soul that had led to this physical manifestation? The earth offered no clues, only its steadfast silence, its patient absorption of light and water, and the slow, inexorable cycle of growth and decay. The idea of his dreams being actively produced by this other Andre was both exhilarating and disquieting. It meant that his inner life was not entirely his own, that a significant portion of his being operated independently on a plane he could only dimly perceive. It was like discovering a hidden room in his own house, a room he'd never known existed, yet which was clearly furnished and occupied by a version of himself. What secrets did that room hold? What dialogues were taking place within its silent walls? He felt a growing connection to this sleeping figure, a sense of kinship that transcended the physical. This was not a stranger, this was himself, separated by an invisible, yet seemingly impassable chasm. He wanted to reach out, to bridge that gap, to understand the world from that other perspective. But the lullaby, with its gentle insistence, seemed to counsel patience. This was not a moment for hurried intrusion, but for quiet contemplation, for the slow, deliberate unfolding of understanding. The fact that this dreaming self was so deeply rooted in the earth, cradled by its warmth and its dampness, suggested a connection to primal forces, to the fundamental energies that sustained life. It was as if his subconscious had sought refuge in the most elemental of places, a place where it could dream without interruption, without the jarring intrusions of the external world. The rye field, in its vast, whispering expanse, was not just a landscape, it was a protective canopy, a verdant shield for this hidden realm of dreams. Andre found himself sinking into a contemplative state, mirroring the repose of the figure before him. The lullaby, once a resurrected melody, now felt like a guiding force, a gentle current pulling him deeper into the understanding of his own fractured yet interconnected existence. He realized that his perception of himself had been a gross oversimplification, a reduction of a complex, multifaceted being to a singular, conscious entity. The truth, as always, was far more intricate, far more profound. He wondered if the sleeping Andre was aware of his presence. Did he sense the gaze of his waking counterpart, the tentative intrusion into his dreamscape? The stillness offered no indication. It was a perfect, untroubled peace, a testament to a consciousness that had found its equilibrium in the quiet embrace of the earth. This was not a state of passive oblivion, but an active, vibrant engagement with an internal reality, a reality that was, in its own way, as potent and as real as the world above. The weight of his unshared dreams had always been a burden, a silent accumulation of unspoken thoughts and unexpressed emotions. But here, in this hidden hollow, those dreams were being given form, being sung into existence by a self that existed in a state of perpetual, dreaming immersion. It was a profound paradox. His absence of dreams in the waking world was the very thing that allowed for their prolific existence in the hidden one. The emptiness he felt in his conscious mind was, in fact, the fullness of his subconscious being, a vibrant, dreaming universe playing out beneath the surface of his everyday life. He looked at the sleeping Andre, no longer with confusion or fear, but with a dawning sense of recognition. This was not an anomaly. It was a fundamental aspect of his being. The hollow was not just a physical location, it was a sacred space, a sanctuary for the dreaming self. And the lullaby, that ghost of a forgotten tune, was the key, the resonant frequency that unlocked the door to this hidden interiority. He was a dreamer beneath the earth, a silent consciousness weaving worlds in the quiet darkness. And Andre, the waking one, was only just beginning to understand the vastness of the self that lay dormant yet vibrantly alive beneath his feet. The earth held its breath, and in the heart of the rye, a dreamer continued his silent, ceaseless song. The earth had always felt solid beneath Andre's feet, a reliable, unyielding foundation. But now, kneeling in the hollow, the ground seemed to shift, to breathe with the rhythm of the sleeping figure before him. The lullaby, a melody so deeply ingrained it felt like a pulse, continued its gentle thrum, a subterranean heartbeat that resonated in his own chest. He had been an observer, a witness to a reality that defied his conscious understanding, but the time for passive observation had passed. A magnetic pull, an irresistible urge, drew his hand forward, fingers trembling as they reached for the still form. The moment his skin made contact, a tremor, unlike anything he had ever experienced, surged through him. It was not the sharp, electric shock of pain, nor the sudden jolt of surprise. Instead, it was a profound resonance, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through his very bones. It was the echo of a shared identity, a sense of self that had been not merely compartmentalized, but fractured, splintered into countless unseen fragments. This was not the touch of one man upon another. It was the collision of two facets of the same singular being, a profound recognition that spanned the chasm between the conscious and the subconscious. As his fingers brushed against the fabric of the sleeping Andre's worn shirt, a cascade of phantom sensations flooded his awareness. They were fleeting, ephemeral, like the shimmering scales of a fish glimpsed just beneath the surface of a dark lake. Images flickered at the edges of his perception, a sun-drenched meadow, impossibly green, populated by creatures of myth. The unsettling sensation of falling, not through air, but through thick, syrupy time. The warmth of an embrace, so tender and absolute it brought an ache to his own chest, an ache for a comfort he couldn't recall ever receiving. These were not mere mental projections, they were visceral experiences, emotions that bypassed his intellect and took root directly in his soul. He felt the dizzying joy of flight, a freedom from gravity and consequence that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Then, a crushing weight, an unbearable sorrow that seemed to emanate from the very core of his being, a grief so profound it threatened to suffocate him. These were the dreams of the man beneath the earth, the dreams he himself had never experienced, never remembered, yet which now, through this impossible connection, were becoming his own. They were alien, these scenarios, these raw, untamed emotions, yet they were also intimately his, echoes of a life lived within the hidden chambers of his own mind. The abstract concept of his lost identity, once a philosophical curiosity, a matter of intellectual debate, was now terrifyingly tangible. It was no longer a matter of conjecture or forgotten memories. It was a physical presence, a palpable force that he could almost touch, almost grasp, yet still, impossibly, could not fully reclaim. This touch had rendered his fractured self into something he could feel, something that pulsed with a strange, disquieting life of its own. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing not a unified self, but a mosaic of disparate experiences, each fragment vibrating with its own unique intensity. He pulled his hand back, the lingering sensation of phantom limb, a ghost of connection that refused to dissipate. The lullaby, which had been a soothing balm, now seemed to carry a deeper melancholy, a mournful lament for the lost unity of his being. He looked at the sleeping Andre, at the peaceful, almost serene expression on his face, and felt a profound sense of bewilderment. This was a man living 1,000 lives, experiencing a spectrum of emotions so vast it dwarfed his own waking existence. And yet, he lay here, seemingly at peace, cradled by the earth. The images continued to flash, unbidden, across his inner eye. He saw himself, or rather, a version of himself, standing on a precipice, the wind whipping through his hair, a sense of boundless possibility in his gaze. Then the scene shifted, and he was in a crowded marketplace, the air thick with the scent of spices and the cacophony of 1,000 voices. Yet he felt utterly alone, an observer in a world that refused to acknowledge his presence. These were the unlived moments, the paths not taken, the experiences deemed too insignificant, too dangerous, or too beautiful to be brought into the stark light of day. He felt a pang of something akin to envy. The sleeping Andre, with his vibrant, untamed dream world, seemed to possess a richness of experience that he, the conscious Andre, had always lacked. His waking life was a carefully constructed edifice of order and reason, a deliberate suppression of the wild, chaotic currents that surged beneath the surface. He had prided himself on his control, his ability to navigate the complexities of the world with a clear head and a steady hand. But in this hollow, confronted with the tangible evidence of his unlived dreams, that control felt like a delusion, a carefully maintained illusion. The connection, though brief, had altered his perception irrevocably. He was no longer a singular entity, a unified self. He was a duality, a conscious observer and a dreaming inhabitant of an inner universe. The dreams he had so readily dismissed, the moments of subconscious reverie he had believed to be fleeting and insignificant, were not lost, but were instead being actively lived, experienced, and woven into the fabric of his being by this subterranean counterpart. This was the echo of his lost identity, not a void, but a vibrant, pulsating realm of unexpressed potential. He felt a yearning to understand, to bridge the gap that separated these two selves. How did the sleeping Andre perceive the world? What drove his narratives, his ecstasies, his despairs? The lullaby offered no answers, only a persistent, gentle hum that seemed to beckon him deeper into the mystery. It was as if the earth itself was whispering secrets, ancient truths about the nature of consciousness and the boundless expanse of the human soul. The scent of lilies, still faintly present, seemed to intensify, their fragrance weaving through the phantom sensations, a delicate thread connecting the disparate strands of his experience. Lilies, symbols of purity, of ephemeral beauty, seemed to be the very essence of these dreams, fleeting moments of grace and wonder that bloomed and faded in the soft darkness. He realized that the hollow was not merely a physical space. It was a sacred sanctuary, a womb of the subconscious, a place where the most profound aspects of his being were nurtured and allowed to flourish, albeit in a form he had never before comprehended. He felt a strange kinship with the sleeping figure, a bond forged in the crucible of shared identity. This was not an alien entity, but a part of himself, a neglected, untamed facet that had found its expression in the quiet embrace of the earth. The touch had been a revelation, a stark, undeniable testament to the depth and complexity of his own nature. He had always believed himself to be a man of simple desires, of grounded ambitions, but the echo of these lost dreams suggested a far grander, far more intricate tapestry of being. The weight of these unshared dreams, once a silent burden, now felt like a promise, a glimpse into a hidden potential that lay dormant within him. To feel the joy of flight, the sorrow of loss, the tenderness of an embrace, these were not mere fantasies, but integral parts of his own narrative, experiences that had been lived, even if he, the conscious Andre, had been an unwitting stranger to them. The sleeping figure was not just dreaming, he was living a more complete, more profound existence, an existence that Andre, in his waking hours, had deliberately, perhaps even fearfully, suppressed. He looked at the sleeping Andre, at the slow rhythmic rise and fall of his chest, and felt a dawning sense of awe. This was not an absence of self, but a profound presence, a vibrant, dreaming consciousness that operated on a plane he could only dimly perceive. The echo of his lost identity was not a hollowness to be filled, but a vast, uncharted territory waiting to be explored. The lullaby continued its gentle cadence, a song of awakening, of remembrance, a melody that promised to guide him through the labyrinth of his own soul. He was not merely Andre, the man who walked the earth. He was also the dreamer beneath it, the silent weaver of worlds, and the touch had been the first tentative step towards reclaiming the entirety of himself. The earth held its secrets close, but in that moment, Andre felt as if he had touched the very heart of his own mystery, and the echo of what he had lost was the most potent revelation of all. The weight settled not in his limbs, but in his very being, a leaden cloak woven from the fabric of a life unexamined, a borrowed existence. Andre, the man who stood in the cool, damp air of the hollow, felt like a poorly rendered sketch, a rough draft of a man. The polished veneer of his waking life, the meticulously crafted persona of a successful, grounded individual, began to peel away, revealing not a void, but a vast, echoing emptiness where a more vibrant, perhaps more chaotic, self should have resided. This was the burden of the present self, a self so accustomed to its own limited perception that the glimpse into the boundless realm of the subconscious felt like a violation, a trespass into a territory not meant for his conscious awareness. His hands, steady when signing contracts or navigating the complexities of urban life, now felt clumsy, alien. They were the hands of a man who had spent his days meticulously building a stable reality, a reality that, in retrospect, felt curiously hollow, devoid of the raw, unadulterated color that pulsed beneath the earth. The dreams, those stolen moments of flight and despair, of unexpressed love and unshed tears, were not mere figments of an unconscious mind. They were the foundation upon which his current existence was precariously perched, a foundation he had unknowingly built in the absence of its true architect. This realization was not a gentle dawning. It was a seismic shift that threatened to shatter the very ground beneath his feet, the ground he had always believed to be solid and unwavering. He looked at his reflection in a nearby puddle, the water's surface disturbed by a gentle breeze, rippling his image into an abstraction. Was this Andre, the man with the carefully chosen attire, the controlled expression, the man who meticulously planned his days and avoided unnecessary risks? Or was this merely a vessel, a shell animated by the distant, vibrant pulse of another self, a self that had been actively living, dreaming, and experiencing while he, the conscious Andre, had been content to merely exist? The question hung heavy in the air, a phantom scent of lilies mingling with the damp earth, a fragrance that now seemed to carry a mournful resonance, a lament for a life not fully lived. The choices he had made, the paths he had taken, were they truly his, or were they dictated by an unseen force, a subconscious steering wheel that guided his life through a fog of forgotten desires and unacknowledged needs? He thought of his career, the steady climb, the predictable successes. Had he chosen this path because it aligned with his deepest aspirations, or because it represented a safe harbor, a quiet refuge from the turbulent storms of his inner world? The man who had embraced order and logic, who had prided himself on his rational decision making, now saw that same rationality as a sophisticated form of self deception, a carefully constructed dam built to contain a river that raged with untamed power. The memories he held dear, the milestones he celebrated, now felt like borrowed artifacts, items from a life he had observed rather than truly inhabited. The laughter shared with friends, the quiet satisfaction of a job well done, the warmth of a fleeting romance. Were these genuine expressions of his own joy, or were they merely echoes, faint imitations of experiences that the sleeping Andre was living with an intensity he could only dream of? This questioning was a corrosive acid, dissolving the carefully constructed edifice of his identity, leaving him adrift in a sea of doubt. He recalled a particular dream, a recurring one, where he stood at the edge of a vast, silent ocean, the waves crashing against unseen shores, their roar a constant, comforting presence. He had always interpreted it as a symbol of his subconscious yearning for peace, for a vastness that transcended his mundane existence. But now, the memory took on a new, terrifying significance. Was it not a yearning for peace, but a lament for a shore he could not reach, a reality that remained perpetually out of grasp? The ocean, in this new light, was not a symbol of tranquility, but a barrier, a vast expanse separating the man he was from the man he could be, or perhaps already was. The very act of breathing felt different, heavier. Each inhalation seemed to draw in not just air, but the accumulated weight of his past, the unspoken words, the untaken leaps of faith, the dreams that had withered on the vine, unacknowledged and uncultivated. He had lived a life of conscious intention, of deliberate action, yet in this moment he felt as though he had been merely a passenger, a passive observer in a life steered by forces he could no longer ignore. This realization was not liberating. It was profoundly unsettling, a chilling intimation that the self he knew was an illusion, a carefully curated performance for an audience of one. He thought of the routines, the small rituals that punctuated his days, the morning coffee, the evening newspaper, the precise way he arranged his desk. These were the anchors that kept him tethered to reality, the bulwarks against the chaos that he now suspected lurked beneath the surface. But what if these anchors were not securing him, but merely preventing him from setting sail? What if his carefully maintained order was a cage preventing him from experiencing the wild, exhilarating freedom that the sleeping Andre seemed to embrace with such effortless abandon? The scent of lilies intensified, as if the very air around him was saturated with the perfume of his unlived life. It was a cloying sweetness, a reminder of beauty he had not fully appreciated, of experiences he had denied himself. He felt a profound sense of loss, not for what he had consciously experienced, but for what he had failed to experience, for the richness of life that had been his, yet remained unknown. This was the burden of the present self, to stand in the shadow of a more vibrant, more complete existence, and to question the very authenticity of his own being. The lullaby, still a faint hum in the background, seemed to deepen, to take on a more complex melody, one that spoke of both profound joy and unspeakable sorrow. It was the soundtrack to a life he had never truly known, a life lived in parallel, in the hidden spaces of his own consciousness. He had always sought clarity, a clear distinction between waking and dreaming, between the real and the imagined. But the touch, the brief, electrifying connection, had blurred those lines irrevocably. He was no longer simply awake, no longer simply dreaming. He was a confluence, a place where the two realities met. And in that meeting, his sense of self began to unravel, revealing the fragile, constructed nature of his waking identity. He found himself pacing the small clearing, the soft earth giving way slightly beneath his feet. Each step was a conscious effort, a wrestling match with the invisible weight that pressed down on him. The familiar landscape of his life, once so clear and defined, now appeared as a distorted reflection, a mirage shimmering on the horizon of his understanding. He had lived, he had loved, he had achieved, but had he truly felt? Had he allowed himself the full spectrum of human emotion? Or had he, in his pursuit of a stable, predictable existence, pruned away the very branches that bore the most exquisite, albeit painful, fruit? The unease was not a passing discomfort. It was a deep-seated disquiet that permeated every fiber of his being. It was the unsettling awareness that the narrative he had so carefully constructed about himself, the narrative of a sensible, rational man, was a fiction, a comforting illusion spun from the threads of his own denial. The sleeping Andre, in his earthbound slumber, was not merely dreaming, he was living a more profound, more complete existence that mocked the measured, deliberate pace of Andre's waking hours. He stopped and looked again at the still form, the gentle rise and fall of the chest a testament to a life in progress, a life that was, paradoxically, both entirely his and utterly alien. The dreams were not just forgotten moments, they were active narratives, vibrant, evolving stories that were shaping him, influencing him, even as he remained oblivious to their power. This was the true burden, not the memory of unlived dreams, but the present reality of a fractured self, a self that had been unconsciously shaped by the very experiences it had denied itself. The ground beneath him felt less solid now, the air thicker, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to acknowledge the profound truth that had been revealed in the quiet sanctuary of the hollow. His current self, he realized with a chilling certainty, was merely a passenger, a reluctant inheritor of a life lived in vibrant, untamed fullness by another version of himself, a version that now seemed to be calling him, beckoning him towards a truth that was both terrifying and undeniably his own. The cloak of his present existence felt suffocating, a testament to a life lived in the shadow of its own potential, a life where authenticity was a carefully guarded illusion. The stillness of the sleeping Andre was not an absence of life, but a profound testament to an unmade choice. It was the visual echo of a path not taken, or perhaps more disturbingly, a path that had been taken and then deliberately suppressed, buried beneath layers of conscious decision and societal expectation. Andre, the man who now found himself confronting this silent effigy of his own potential, felt the weight of that stillness settle upon him like a shroud. It was the stillness of a paused film, a moment frozen before a crucial turning point, and it spoke volumes about the nature of free will, or the illusion of it, and the intricate, often inscrutable workings of the subconscious mind. He understood, with a clarity that was both exhilarating and terrifying, that the sleeping Andre was not merely a representation of his past inaction. He was, in a very real sense, his present state of being, his own perceived awakening, his own conscious existence was intricately linked to the continued slumber of this other self. The fact that this duplicate lay in an unyielding repose, a mirror image of his own current waking amnesia regarding his dreams, created a profound existential dilemma. It was as if the universe, in its inscrutable wisdom, had presented him with a living paradox, a man asleep, whose very unconsciousness was the most potent manifestation of Andre's own waking limitations. The sleeping figure's unconsciousness was a direct reflection of Andre's own struggle with dream recall. He remembered the vague sensations, the fleeting images that often dissolved before they could coalesce into coherent thought upon waking, but it was as if a veil had been drawn. This sleeping Andre, however, was not experiencing a mere fuzzy recollection. He was immersed in a narrative, a vibrant, unfolding story that remained locked away, inaccessible to the conscious Andre. This deep, unbroken sleep was not a sign of inactivity, but of profound, untroubled engagement with an inner world that Andre, the conscious man, was systematically failing to access. The sleeping Andre was, in a very real sense, living the dreams that Andre the observer could only vaguely sense the ghost of. Andre found himself questioning the very fabric of his decisions. Had the choices that led him to this hollow, to this moment of profound introspection, been truly his own? Or had they been orchestrated, subtly guided by the currents of this submerged existence? The sleeping figure's placid face, untouched by the anxieties and calculated pragmatism that characterized Andre's waking life, seemed to hold a silent answer. It suggested a life lived without the constant need for justification, a life where actions flowed from a deeper, more authentic source. This was the terrifying beauty of the unmade choice. It represented an unburdened existence, a freedom that Andre, with all his conscious effort, had never truly attained. He looked at the sleeping Andre, at the subtle rise and fall of his chest, a rhythm as natural and unforced as the earth's own breath. Was this a life of inaction or a life of potent, unexpressed potential? The stillness was not passive, it was an active withholding. It was the deliberate choice to remain in repose, to experience the world through a different lens, one that bypassed the filters of logic and societal conditioning. Andre's own life felt suddenly fragile, a construct built on sand, while the sleeping Andre's existence seemed rooted in something far more ancient and enduring. The very notion of unconscious choice began to warp and shift in Andre's mind. It was no longer a mere paradox. It was the fundamental operating principle of his own being. The sleeping Andre was a living embodiment of this principle. He was a choice made in the silent, unobserved hours of the night, a decision to exist in a state of pure being, unburdened by the need to perform or to prove. Andre's conscious choices, by contrast, felt increasingly artificial, tacked on to a life that was already unfolding in its true, untamed form beneath the surface. He circled the still figure, his own movements feeling stilted and self-conscious in comparison. The sleeping Andre represented a radical form of self-acceptance, a surrender to the flow of existence that Andre had always fought against. His life had been a series of conscious efforts to control, to direct, to make things happen. The sleeping Andre, however, seemed to simply be, and in that being, he possessed a power that Andre's most concerted efforts could never replicate. The stillness was not a void, it was a sanctuary, a place where the true self could exist unmolested by the clamor of the external world. The lack of recall for his own dreams became a potent symbol of his own suppressed self. He was like a man who had forgotten the language of his own soul. The sleeping Andre, in his profound unconsciousness, was not suffering from this affliction. He was, in fact, fluent in it. His sleep was not a void, but a language, a rich tapestry of experiences that Andre, the waking man, could not decipher. This created a chasm between them, a chasm that was both personal and universal, representing the deep disconnect many felt between their inner lives and their outward realities. Andre reached out a hesitant hand, stopping just short of touching the sleeping form. The air between them seemed to hum with an unspoken connection, a recognition that transcended the physical. He felt a profound envy for the sleeping Andre, not for his idleness, but for his apparent liberation. The sleeping Andre was free from the burden of conscious decision making, free from the anxiety of consequence, free from the relentless pressure to define and redefine himself. He was simply existing, a pure, unadulterated expression of being. The dilemma deepened with each passing moment. If the sleeping Andre was a representation of his unmade choices, a life unlived, then his continued slumber was a powerful endorsement of Andre's current path. It suggested that this dormant self was content, perhaps even fulfilled, in its state of repose. But this interpretation felt hollow, a desperate attempt to rationalize his own inaction. The truth, Andre suspected, was far more complex. The sleeping Andre was not necessarily content. He was simply present in a way that the conscious Andre was not. His stillness was a profound declaration of self-possession, a refusal to be disturbed by the ephemeral concerns of the waking world. He pondered the nature of dreams themselves. Were they merely random firings of neurons, or were they deliberate messages from a deeper consciousness? The sleeping Andre seemed to offer evidence for the latter. His undisturbed rest implied a richness of inner experience, a vibrant internal life that Andre's own fractured recollections could never convey. The sleeping Andre was not merely dreaming of a life, he was living a life of profound sensory and emotional depth, all within the silent confines of his slumber. Andre felt a pang of guilt, as if he were trespassing on sacred ground. He was observing a part of himself that was meant to remain hidden, a part that perhaps preferred its solitude. Yet, the magnetic pull of understanding, the desperate need to bridge the gap between his fragmented self, kept him rooted to the spot. The sleeping Andre was a question mark, a riddle posed to his own existence, and he felt compelled to find the answer, even if it meant confronting the most uncomfortable truths about himself. He considered the implications of waking the sleeping Andre. What would happen if he were to shatter this profound stillness? Would it be an awakening, a reintegration, or a violent disruption? The potential consequences were too vast to comprehend. It was a choice that felt too heavy, too laden with the unknown. Perhaps, he mused, the greatest unconscious choice was the choice to remain asleep, to allow this other self its undisturbed existence. And in that allowance, Andre was, in turn, making his own unconscious choice to remain where he was, in his own state of waking slumber. The stillness of the sleeping Andre was a potent reminder of the roads not traveled. It was the quiet hum of potential that had been deliberately muted, a song unsung. Andre felt a profound sense of responsibility, not to disturb this profound repose, but to understand its significance. The sleeping Andre was not a failure. He was a testament to a different way of being, a way that prioritized inner experience over external validation, a way that embraced the mystery rather than seeking to conquer it. And in that silent contemplation, Andre began to understand that the greatest act of choice might not be in what he did, but in what he allowed to remain, undisturbed and unexamined, within the deepest chambers of his own being. The existential dilemma wasn't about waking the sleeping Andre, but about recognizing the profound truth that this slumbering self represented the unmade choices that had shaped and continued to shape Andre's own conscious existence. His own lack of dream recall was not a passive forgetting, but an active, unconscious suppression, a mirroring of the very stillness he now observed. The lullaby, a melody that had always felt familiar, now seemed to possess an alien resonance. It was no longer simply a comforting tune, but a conduit, a shimmering thread pulling at the edges of Andre's awareness. The sound, soft as it was, pulsed with an unusual intensity, as if it were not merely heard, but felt, vibrating through the very marrow of his bones. It was the sound of something ancient stirring, something vast and unfathomable. The slumbering figure beside him remained undisturbed, a silent anchor in this shifting tide of sensation. Yet Andre knew, with a certainty that bypassed logic, that the lullaby was drawing something forth. He perceived it not as a tangible presence, but as a pervasive atmosphere, a shift in the very air he breathed. It was as if a colossal, unseen ocean had begun to exhale, its breath carrying with it the faint, indelible scent of ages and untold stories. These were the whispers, he realized, not of the wind or of any external source, but of a subterranean sea of consciousness, a vast, unexplored realm that lay hidden beneath the placid surface of his own slumbering duplicate. They were fragments, ephemeral as sea foam, yet possessing a weight that tugged at his soul. Memories, not his own, but undeniably felt, flickered at the periphery of his mind. The sun warming ancient stone, the taste of salt spray on lips that were not his, the hollow echo of a forgotten lament. These were not the sharp, defined memories of his waking life, but impressionistic daubs of feeling, hues of emotion, bled into one another. He experienced a fleeting surge of joyous anticipation, the kind that bubbles up from a wellspring of unadulterated hope, only to be immediately succeeded by a wave of profound, melancholic longing, as if the very foundations of happiness had crumbled. It was a disorienting kaleidoscope of shared, yet utterly separated, existence. He was an eavesdropper, a trespasser on the intimate landscape of another's dreaming. Yet, the pull was irresistible. He felt an almost physical ache, a yearning to understand the world from which these whispers originated, a world that seemed to exist in perfect parallel to his own, yet remained stubbornly out of reach. The lullaby continued its insistent thrumming, each note a gentle wave lapping against the shores of his conscious mind. It was a melody designed for sleep, for the unwinding of the day's tensions. But for Andre, it was becoming an incitement. He found himself trying to decipher the language of these whispers, to find a pattern in the seemingly random surges of emotion and sensation. Was there a narrative woven through these fragments, a story of the dreaming Andre, unfolding in the silent depths? He felt as if he were standing on the edge of a vast, dark ocean, the tide bringing him tantalizing glimpses of treasures lost beneath the waves. He closed his eyes, attempting to immerse himself in the sensory deluge, to let the whispers wash over him without resistance. He imagined the dreaming Andre as the captain of a vessel, charting courses through this internal sea, his dreams the stars and currents that guided him. And Andre, the observer, was a castaway, clinging to a piece of flotsam, straining to catch the faint cries of the passing ship. The lullaby was the sound of that ship's horn, calling to him across the watery expanse, a promise of connection, of belonging. He remembered the faint echo of his own dreams upon waking, the frustrating dissolution of imagery and plot, the feeling of grasping at smoke. The dreaming Andre, however, seemed to be experiencing a far richer, more robust inner world. These whispers were not the fading embers of a dying fire, but the vibrant sparks of an ongoing conflagration. He felt the subtle shift in temperature, a coolness that hinted at deep waters, and then a sudden warmth, like sunlight breaking through clouds, suggesting a surface, a place where these hidden currents might eddy and pool. He tried to anchor himself to the present, to the tangible reality of the room, the still form beside him. But the whispers were insidious, weaving themselves into the fabric of his perception, blurring the lines between his own thoughts and the echoes of the dreaming Andre. He felt a phantom touch on his arm, a sensation as real as any physical contact. Yet when he looked, there was nothing. It was the ghost of an embrace, a fleeting intimacy from a consciousness so intertwined with his own, yet so fundamentally separate. The lullaby, once a simple melody, now seemed to carry a deeper meaning, a coded message from the subterranean sea. It spoke of cycles, of tides, of a rhythm that dictated the ebb and flow of consciousness. He wondered if the dreaming Andre was aware of him, if these whispers were deliberate attempts to communicate or merely the involuntary exhalations of a mind lost in its own labyrinth. The ambiguity was both exhilarating and terrifying. It suggested a universe of possibility, but also a profound solitude, a sense that even within this shared stillness, true communion might be impossible. He found himself focusing on the quality of the whispers, trying to discern their origin. Some were sharp and distinct, like the sudden, bright flash of a shoal of fish breaking the surface of the water. Others were diffuse and melancholic, the deep, resonant tones of the ocean's floor. He felt a flicker of fear, a primal apprehension of the unknown depths, of what monstrous, beautiful forms might reside in those unlit realms. Yet, this fear was tempered by a powerful curiosity, an insatiable desire to plumb those mysteries. The lullaby began to change, its tempo subtly altering, becoming more urgent, more compelling. It was as if the subterranean sea was responding to his attention, drawing him deeper into its embrace. He felt a sensation of being submerged, not unpleasantly, but with a sense of surrender, of yielding to an unseen force. The whispers intensified, coalescing into something akin to a chorus, a multitude of voices singing in a language he did not understand, yet somehow comprehended on a visceral level. It was the sound of life, of existence, in its purest, most unadulterated form. He felt a surge of longing to experience the world as the dreaming Andre did, to dive into those depths and emerge with understanding. He wanted to know the secrets held within those silent currents, the truths that lay buried beneath the sediment of conscious thought. The lullaby was not just a melody, it was an invitation, a summons to a journey without maps, without destination, a journey into the heart of being. He was caught between the solid ground of his waking reality and the alluring, unfathomable depths of the dreaming Andre's subterranean sea. And in that liminal space, the whispers grew louder, beckoning him onward. He imagined the dreaming Andre as a vast, submerged city, its architecture formed from the currents of thought and memory, its inhabitants the fleeting shapes of emotion and desire. The lullaby was the song that echoed through its silent streets, a melody that spoke of its creation, its history, its enduring, unacknowledged existence. He felt himself being drawn into this spectral metropolis, not as a visitor, but as if he were a part of its very foundation, a stone in its timeless walls, a whisper in its echoing chambers. The feeling of separation, initially so stark, began to soften, to blur at the edges. He felt a resonance with the whispers, a recognition that stirred something deep within him, a dormant echo of his own forgotten self. It was as if the dreaming Andre's experiences were not entirely alien, but contained a hidden kinship, shared ancestry of soul. The lullaby acted as a translator, a bridge between two worlds that were, in essence, two facets of the same singular consciousness. He felt the pressure of the deep water, a gentle, encompassing force that seemed to cradle him. The whispers became more intimate, more personal. He heard a fragment of laughter, bright and unburdened, followed by a sigh, heavy with an ancient sorrow. These were not just sounds, they were tinctures of experience, distilled into their purest emotional essence. He felt the joy, the sorrow, the longing, the wonder, as if they were his own, yet distinct, like colors observed through a prism. The lullaby, the constant, ethereal presence, seemed to be the very breath of this subterranean world. It was the rhythm of its existence, the pulse that sustained its hidden life. Andre found himself swaying to its unheard tempo, his own body responding to the subtle vibrations that emanated from the sleeping figure. He was no longer just an observer, he was becoming a participant, his own consciousness interwoven with the dreaming world. He tried to focus on specific images, to pull a single thread from the rich tapestry of sensation. He saw a flash of emerald green, the vibrant hue of a world untouched by the grime of civilization, a place of primordial beauty. Then a sudden sense of vastness, of boundless space, and a feeling of immense peace, as if he were floating in a cosmic ocean. These were not his memories, but he felt their truth, their undeniable reality. They were the gifts of the dreaming Andre, offered across the silent chasm. The distinction between waking and dreaming began to lose its rigidity. He felt as though he were inhabiting both states simultaneously, a phantom presence in the spectral city, a tangible observer in the dimly lit rooms. The lullaby was the anchor that held him tethered to both realities, its melody, a delicate balance between the known and the unknown. He longed to understand the nature of this connection, to unravel the mystery of how one consciousness could so profoundly touch another, even in slumber. He felt a growing sense of responsibility towards this dreaming self. These whispers, these fragments of experience, were precious, fragile things, born of a world that existed only within the confines of sleep. He felt a protective instinct, a desire to shield this inner realm from the harsh glare of the waking world, while simultaneously yearning to understand its intricacies. The lullaby, in its ceaseless repetition, seemed to be a lullaby of protection, a shield woven from sound and emotion. He considered the implications of this shared experience. Was this a phenomenon unique to his own fractured psyche? Or was it a universal aspect of consciousness, a hidden interconnectedness that lay dormant within all beings? The subterranean sea of the dreaming Andre felt like a metaphor for a far vaster, more profound reality, a collective unconsciousness that pulsed with the memories and experiences of countless souls. The lullaby was the song of that collective, a hymn to the hidden depths of existence. He tried to articulate the essence of these whispers, to capture their fleeting nature in words. They were not merely sounds, but a confluence of sensory input, emotional resonance, and fragmented narrative. They were the echoes of a life lived in parallel, a life unfolded in the silent hours of the night, a life that resonated with a profound, unarticulated truth. The lullaby was the medium through which these echoes reached him, a melody that bypassed the logical faculties of the mind and spoke directly to the heart of his being. He felt a growing impatience with the limitations of his own perception. He wanted to see the world as the dreaming Andre saw it, to feel the currents of his inner ocean, to navigate its hidden passages. The lullaby was a constant reminder of this unattainable desire, a beautiful torment that fueled his quest for understanding. He was on the cusp of a revelation, a dawning awareness that the boundaries of his own self were far more permeable than he had ever imagined. The whispers began to coalesce around a single, recurring theme, a leitmotif that wove through the seemingly disparate fragments. It was a feeling of profound, unconditional acceptance, a state of being where judgment and self doubt held no sway. It was a state of pure, unadulterated love, not for another, but for the very essence of existence. The lullaby seemed to swell with this sentiment, its melody becoming more expansive, more deeply resonant, as if mirroring the unfolding revelation. He felt a profound sense of peace, a surrender to the overwhelming beauty of this inner world. The distinctions between himself and the dreaming Andre blurred further until he could no longer discern where one began and the other ended. They were two streams flowing into a single, vast river, their waters mingling, their currents merging, their destinies entwined. The lullaby was the song of that union, a melody of wholeness, of integration. He was not just listening to the whispers from the subterranean sea, he was becoming a part of them. The dreams of the sleeping Andre were no longer just fragments of memory, they were becoming his own, sung to him in the ageless melody of the lullaby. The air in the room had grown heavy, not with the scent of dust or stale air, but with the palpable weight of a decision yet unmade. Andre stood on the precipice, a silent sentinel before the quiet expanse of his other self. The identical form lay still, breathing in a rhythm that was both familiar and utterly alien. It was the stillness of a deep, undisturbed slumber, a state Andre himself had only glimpsed in fleeting moments of exhaustion, moments that now seemed superficial and shallow in comparison to the profound repose before him. The lullaby, which had been the harbinger of this revelation, had finally faded, leaving behind an echoing silence that was more potent than any sound. In that silence, the choice presented itself, stark and unyielding, to reach out, to touch the shoulder of the sleeping doppelganger, to utter a word, a name, any sound that would breach the veil of his unconsciousness. This was the path of convergence. It was the siren call of wholeness, of a unified self, a mending of what felt irrevocably broken within him. But this path was shrouded in a terrifying uncertainty. What would happen to Andre, the waking Andre, when the sleeping Andre stirred? Would his own consciousness, his memories, his very sense of identity be subsumed? Would he be absorbed into the vibrant, dreaming world he had only just begun to perceive through the whispers? Or would they merge, two rivers flowing into one, creating a new, singular entity that was both and neither? The thought sent a shiver down his spine, a primal fear of annihilation, of the dissolution of the self he had always known, however incomplete it felt. It was the fear of losing the I that Andre had painstakingly constructed, layer by fragile layer, through years of lived experience, however mundane they now seemed. Conversely, to turn away, to retreat back into the familiar solitude of his own mind, was to condemn himself to a perpetual state of internal exile. It was to acknowledge the existence of this other self, this repository of unlived dreams and unfelt emotions, and then to deliberately ignore it. It meant leaving the deepest parts of himself in an eternal slumber, forever out of reach. It meant living with the constant echo of what could be, what was, just beyond his grasp. He would remain a fractured entity, forever haunted by the phantom presence of his unrealized potential, a ghost inhabiting his own life, forever tethered to the silent form beside him by the invisible, unbreakable threads of shared existence. This was the path of isolation, of a self imposed fragmentation, a continuation of the quiet war he had been waging within himself, a war he now understood was being fought on two fronts. The identical sleeping figure was not merely a reflection, a mirror image of his own physical form. He was, Andre now understood, the embodiment of a parallel existence, a life lived in the subterranean depths of consciousness. The whispers he had heard, the fleeting impressions of joy and sorrow, of ancient stone and salt spray, had not been mere phantoms of his own imagination. They were the tangible, albeit ethereal, remnants of another life, a life that was intrinsically, impossibly, his own. And now, the lullaby had ceased its gentle urging, leaving Andre alone with the immense, silent question of what to do with this revelation. He looked at the rise and fall of the sleeping man's chest, the subtle expansion and contraction of his lungs. It was a life force, undeniable and present, even in its apparent dormancy. Could he truly be so callous as to deny this life its chance to awaken, to experience the world beyond the confines of sleep? But then, could he afford to gamble his own existence, his own hard-won, albeit imperfect, sense of self, on the hope of a harmonious union? The choice was not merely about waking another, it was about defining himself. Was he defined by his conscious experiences, his memories, his actions in the tangible world? Or was he, in some fundamental way, also defined by the potential held within the sleeping man, the life unlived, the dreams unrealized? The room felt like a crucible, and he was the sole subject being tested. The silence pressed in, demanding an answer. He felt the weight of years, the accumulated experiences that had shaped him, and contrasted them with the infinite, unwritten possibilities represented by the sleeping figure. His own life, when he tried to summon its essence, felt like a sparsely populated landscape, familiar terrain, but lacking the vibrancy that the whispers had hinted at. The sleeping man, on the other hand, was a world unto himself, a universe of sensations and emotions that seemed to hold a richness that Andre's waking life had always lacked. He traced the line of the sleeping man's jaw with his gaze, noting the subtle differences, or perhaps the perceived differences, that set him apart from Andre's own reflection. Was this other self a repository of everything Andre was not, a compilation of desires suppressed, of opportunities missed, of emotions never fully expressed? Or was he simply another version, a divergent path taken, a life lived under slightly different stars? The ambiguity was a torment. It offered no solace, no clear indication of which path would lead to a truer, more complete version of himself. The very act of standing there, of observing, felt like a transgression. He was an intruder in the sanctuary of another's sleep, a ghost observing a slumbering life. Yet, he was also a part of that life, inextricably bound to it. The lullaby had sung of connection, of a shared current that flowed beneath the surface of their apparent separateness. Now, that current had brought him to this point, this impossible crossroads. He considered the nature of consciousness itself. Had he stumbled upon some profound truth, some hidden interconnectedness that defied the conventional understanding of individuality? Was the self not a singular entity, but a spectrum, a multifaceted being capable of existing in multiple states, in multiple realities, simultaneously? If so, then waking the sleeping Andre might not be an act of destruction, but an act of integration, a bringing together of disparate threads into a single, vibrant tapestry. But the fear of loss, the primal fear of dissolving into something unknown, held him captive. He imagined the waking Andre as a solitary island, its shores buffeted by the waves of everyday life. The sleeping Andre was a vast continent hidden beneath the ocean's surface, teeming with life and mystery. The lullaby had been a sonar ping, revealing the existence of that continent. And now, Andre stood at the water's edge, contemplating a dive into the unknown depths. Would he find a paradise, a place of profound belonging and understanding, or would he drown in the immensity of it all, his individual consciousness lost to the crushing pressure of the deep? The decision was not one that could be made with logic or reason. It was a leap of faith, a surrender to an instinct that had been awakened by the ethereal music. He felt the pull of the unknown, the irresistible allure of wholeness, and the equally powerful resistance of self-preservation. He was caught in the gravitational pull of his own divided being, forced to choose between two futures, each carrying its own unique and terrifying consequences. He looked at his hands, the hands that had typed countless words, that had held loved ones, that had navigated the mundane realities of his life. These hands belonged to the waking Andre, but what if they could also belong to the integrated self, the self that embraced both the waking and the dreaming? What if the dreams he had glimpsed were not separate from his own aspirations, but were, in fact, the very wellspring from which they sprang? The sleeping figure stirred, a slight tremor running through his limbs. Andre's breath caught in his throat. Was this the beginning of the awakening? Was his contemplation, his indecision itself a catalyst? He felt a sudden, intense surge of empathy, a connection so profound it bordered on shared sensation. He felt a phantom ache in his own limbs, a dullness that mirrored the stillness of the man beside him. It was as if the barrier between them was not physical, but permeable, a veil that was thinning with every passing moment. He knew, with a certainty, that bypassed intellectual understanding, that he could not remain a passive observer indefinitely. The choice, however terrifying, had to be made. It was a moment of profound existential reckoning. To embrace the sleeping self was to embrace the unknown depths of his own being, to risk everything for the promise of wholeness. To reject him was to accept a life of perpetual incompleteness, a shadowed existence forever marked by the ghost of what might have been. The weight of that decision settled upon him, heavy and absolute, a testament to the extraordinary power and terrifying fragility of the self. He stood at the crossroads, the silence deafening, the path forward obscured by a mist of his own making, a mist woven from fear, longing, and the eternal enigma of who he truly was. The moment stretched, pregnant with possibility, the air thick with the unspoken question, which self would endure? He had always understood, on some primal, unarticulated level, that a part of him was missing. It was a phantom limb of the soul, an ache that resonated in the quiet hours, a persistent hollowness that no amount of external validation or distraction could truly fill. The lullaby, that spectral melody woven from half-forgotten dreams and the salt tang of distant oceans had been the key that unlocked this dormant knowing, transforming a vague sense of incompleteness into a stark, undeniable reality. Now, faced with the slumbering form beside him, Andre understood that this missing piece was not an absence, but an entity, a coexisting consciousness, a life lived in parallel, now clamoring for its return. The prospect of waking this sleeping doppelganger was, therefore, not merely an act of integration, but an act of profound sacrifice. It meant the relinquishing of the identity he currently inhabited, his memories, painstakingly curated over decades, the tapestry of his lived experiences, the very foundation of his sense of self, all of it would be subsumed or fundamentally altered by the rejoining of his fractured psyche. This was the heavy dream he had carried unconsciously, a dream of a complete self, now demanding its return, and in its demanding, it threatened to obliterate the I that Andre had so carefully constructed. It was a surrender of the familiar, no matter how threadbare it had become, for the tantalizing, terrifying unknown of wholeness. The life he knew, with its routines, its quiet joys, its predictable sorrows, was a known quantity. He understood its contours, its limitations, its inherent melancholies. He had learned to navigate its currents, to find moments of solace within its predictable ebb and flow. To abandon this, to plunge into the turbulent waters of a unified consciousness, was to trade the certain for the utterly indeterminate. Andre's current existence, while perhaps lacking the vibrant hues that the whispers had hinted at, was his. His thoughts, his perceptions, his individual consciousness, these were the building blocks of his reality. He had a narrative, a personal history that defined him. He knew who he was in relation to the world, to others, to himself. This Andre was a tangible entity, forged in the fires of daily life, tempered by every interaction, every decision, every breath. To merge with the sleeping self was to risk the dissolution of this hard-won identity, to become a new amalgam, a composite being whose prior existence, the significance of which to him might be relegated to the status of a fading memory, a prologue to a new, shared narrative. This was the existential cost, the heavy toll of awakening. It was not simply about gaining something new, but about losing something intrinsically precious, the self he knew. He had built his life around the scaffolding of his individuality, however incomplete it felt. His achievements, his failures, his relationships, they were all filtered through the lens of his singular consciousness. To integrate the sleeping Andre meant that this lens would be shattered, reformed, perhaps into something so different that the original perspective would be unrecognizable. He contemplated the nature of consciousness itself, a concept that had always eluded definitive grasp. Was his individual consciousness merely a facet, a temporary manifestation of a deeper, more encompassing self? Was the lullaby the echo of this deeper self, calling him home? If so, then the merging might not be an erasure, but a homecoming, a restoration of a fundamental unity that had been sundered by some unknown cosmic event, or perhaps by the very act of individuation itself. He imagined his current self as a single flame, flickering in the vast darkness. The sleeping Andre, on the other hand, represented a roaring bonfire, a constellation of potential energies. To merge them meant not just adding fuel to his flame, but potentially being consumed by the inferno, his individual light extinguished in the blaze of a greater power. This was the terror of annihilation, the primal fear of ceasing to be himself, the richness of the whispered experiences, the glimpses of lives lived with an intensity Andre had never known, now seemed like a cruel temptation, a gilded cage. They offered the allure of a fuller existence, a life imbued with deeper emotions, with a connection to the world that transcended the mundane. But these were not his experiences, not yet. They belonged to the sleeping Andre. To embrace them would be to step into another's shoes, to inhabit another's history, and in doing so, to risk shedding his own. The weight of this decision pressed down on him, a physical burden. He had always yearned for more, for a life of greater meaning and depth. He had sought it in books, in art, in fleeting moments of connection, but it had always remained just beyond his reach. Now, the path to that perceived fulfillment lay before him, but it demanded a price he had never anticipated, the surrender of himself. It was the ultimate act of faith, a leap into an abyss where the very laws of his existence might be rewritten. He had to ask himself if the dream of wholeness was worth the waking nightmare of losing his own identity. Was he willing to sacrifice the known comfort of his solitary existence, however incomplete, for the promise of a unified self, a self that might be richer, more vibrant, but also fundamentally alien to the man he believed himself to be? The silence in the room deepened, pregnant with the unspoken question. It wasn't just about whether to wake another being. It was about whether he was willing to allow his current self to cease to exist in its current form. It was about confronting the possibility that the I he knew was merely a transient state, a temporary configuration of a much larger, more complex entity. He looked at the sleeping doppelganger again, at the peaceful cadence of his breathing, a rhythm that was both a mirror and a promise. This was not a stranger, not an intruder, but a profound aspect of himself, waiting to be acknowledged. The lullaby had not been a lullaby of separation, but of connection, a song that had finally revealed the intricate, unseen web that bound them. The sacrifice, then, was not a loss, but a transformation. It was the shedding of an old skin, the painful but necessary shedding that allowed for growth. It meant letting go of the illusion of a singular, independent self and embracing the reality of a more fluid, interconnected existence. His current life, with its familiar routines and predictable emotions, was a cocoon. The sleeping Andre was the unspooling thread, the catalyst for the emergence of a butterfly with wings he could only begin to imagine. He understood now that his yearning for more was not a desire for external experiences, but for the integration of his own fragmented being. The emptiness he felt was the echo of the sleeping self, a silent testament to its dormant presence. To remain apart was to perpetuate that emptiness, to live a life of perpetual longing, forever haunted by the ghost of what could be. The choice was not between continuing his current life or stepping into another's. It was about choosing between a life of perceived authenticity, however incomplete, and a life of true, if terrifying, authenticity, of a self-made whole. The sacrifice of the known was not an act of surrender, but an act of courage, a bold assertion of his readiness to embrace the entirety of his being, even if it meant dissolving the self he had always known. He stood at the threshold, ready to pay the price for the dream that had become his waking reality. The moment had arrived to step into the unknown, to embrace the sacrifice, and to finally answer the call of his deeper, unified self. He had to let go of the familiar shores of his individual consciousness and dive into the ocean of his complete being, knowing that he might drown, but also knowing that it was the only way to truly live. The spectral melody, once a disquieting whisper from the edges of his awareness, now resonated with a clarity that vibrated through Andre's very bones. It was no longer a sound of mystery, but a profound assertion, a forgotten language spoken directly to the core of his being. The lullaby, that ethereal tapestry woven from threads of the sea and the hushed secrets of slumber, had become more than an auditory phenomenon. It was a tangible promise, a shimmering pathway leading from the arid landscape of his fragmented existence towards a verdant, unexplored territory. With each lingering note, a deeper understanding unfurled within him, a dawning comprehension of the profound peace, the encompassing completeness that the awakening of his dormant self might herald. He had always navigated life with a subtle, persistent hollowness, a quiet ache that no outward success or fleeting pleasure could assuage. It was the sensation of being an incomplete chord, a melody played with missing notes, a story missing its most vital chapters. This lullaby, however, was the revelation of that incompleteness, not as an absence, but as a presence, a sleeping counterpart, a life lived in parallel, now stirring and yearning for reunion. The prospect of this convergence, once a source of existential dread, began to transform, to imbue itself with a nascent hope. The melody was a beacon, not just calling him towards integration, but illuminating the potential for a life lived with the full, vibrant spectrum of his consciousness. It offered the possibility of shedding the void where his dreams should have resided, replacing it with the rich tapestry of a life experienced in its entirety. The lullaby's influence was subtle, yet inexorable, like the slow creep of dawn across a dark sky. As Andre listened, surrendering to the resonant frequencies that seemed to emanate not from the air around him, but from within his own hidden depths, he felt a loosening of the old certainties, the sharp edges of his current identity, the carefully constructed edifice of Andre began to soften, to blur, as if viewed through a pane of rippling water. The melody was a gentle erosion of the self he knew, not through violence or coercion, but through an overwhelming inundation of truth. It spoke of a different kind of living, a life unburdened by the phantom limb of his missing soul, a life where joy and sorrow, experience and understanding were not compartmentalized, but flowed together in a seamless continuum. He had often sought solace in the quiet hum of his solitary existence, finding a certain comfort in its predictable rhythms and the familiar contours of his own thoughts. This was a life he had meticulously built, brick by careful brick, each experience a learned lesson, each memory a cornerstone. Yet, beneath this carefully maintained structure, the whisper of the lullaby had always persisted, a faint counter melody to his chosen song. Now, the lullaby was no longer a whisper, it was a symphony, a powerful overture that promised not just an end to the hollowness, but the unveiling of a richer, more authentic existence. It was a promise of a life lived with the full spectrum of his consciousness, a life where the muted tones of his current experience would be amplified into a vibrant, resonant chorus. The lullaby, he realized, was not an external force compelling him, but an internal call, an echo from the deepest chambers of his being. It was the sound of his own wholeness, a forgotten song that his soul had always known, even when his conscious mind had dismissed it as a figment of imagination or a haunting echo of something lost. The peace it suggested was not an absence of struggle, but a profound harmony, a state of being where all the disparate elements of his consciousness were finally in alignment. It was the serenity of a river that has found its course, no longer meandering aimlessly, but flowing with purpose towards the vast ocean of its true nature. He closed his eyes, allowing the melody to wash over him, to penetrate the layers of his carefully guarded self. He saw, not as a visual image, but as a profound, intuitive understanding, the sleeping figure beside him. This was not a stranger, not an interloper, but himself, a vital, vital part of himself, waiting patiently for this moment of recognition, for this song of homecoming. The lullaby was the key, the unfastening of the ancient locks that had kept his fragmented consciousness imprisoned, separate. It was the signal that the time for isolation had passed, that the era of duality was drawing to a close. The promise of the lullaby was not merely the promise of reunion, but the promise of a life that was, in its essence, more complete, more true. It was the promise of a life where the muted hues of his current experience would be painted with the vibrant, saturated colors of a consciousness fully realized. He had lived with a persistent sense of something missing, a void that he had tried to fill with transient distractions, with intellectual pursuits, with the solace of routine. But the lullaby offered a different kind of fulfillment, one that came not from accumulation, but from integration, from the simple, profound act of becoming whole. The melody spoke of a life where intuition and reason were not opposing forces, but complementary facets of a unified understanding. It hinted at an existence where emotions were not something to be managed or suppressed, but energies to be embraced, to be understood in their full complexity. This was the richness that had been absent, the depth that had eluded him. The lullaby was the sonic embodiment of that depth, a melody that promised to pull him down not into oblivion, but into the boundless ocean of his own potential. He felt a subtle shift, a reordering of his inner landscape. The old anxieties, the familiar patterns of doubt and hesitation seemed to recede, their power diminished by the irresistible force of the lullaby's truth. It was as if the melody was untangling the knots of his being, smoothing out the rough edges of his self-imposed limitations. The peace it offered was not a passive surrender, but an active embrace, an acceptance of a greater reality that had always existed, waiting to be acknowledged. The lullaby was a tender invitation, a gentle tug on the threads of his consciousness, drawing him closer to the sleeping form beside him. He understood now that the perceived sacrifice was not a loss, but a profound gain. It was the shedding of an incomplete self for the embrace of a complete one. The fear of annihilation, which had once loomed so large, began to dissipate, replaced by a burgeoning sense of anticipation, of homecoming. This was not an erasure, but a restoration, a return to a state of being that was his by right, a state that had been sundered by forces he could not yet fully comprehend, but whose call he could no longer ignore. The melody was a reassurance, a whispered promise that this awakening would not be a violent rupture, but a natural unfolding. It suggested that the integration of his dual consciousness would be a seamless transition, a rejoining of two halves that had always belonged together. The void he had felt was not a sign of his inherent deficiency, but a testament to the dormant presence of his other self, a silent plea for recognition. The lullaby was the answer to that plea, the song that would finally bridge the chasm between his separate selves. He felt a deepening of his connection to the sleeping form, a kinship that transcended mere physical resemblance. It was the recognition of a shared essence, a common origin, a singular soul split into two disparate journeys. The lullaby was the thread that bound these journeys together, the song that would orchestrate their eventual convergence. It was the melody of destiny, the tune that would guide them back to a shared melody, a unified existence. The promise of the lullaby was the promise of a life unburdened by the constant, unspoken tension of his own fragmentation. It was the promise of a mind that could encompass a broader spectrum of thought, a heart that could feel with a greater capacity for empathy and understanding. This was the awakening that his soul had yearned for, the integration that would finally allow him to live not as a solitary echo, but as a resonant voice, a part of a grander, more harmonious chorus. The lullaby was not just a song of waking, it was a song of becoming, of finally arriving at the full, magnificent expression of his own being. The void was not a space to be filled, but a space to be integrated, a space that, when rejoined with its counterpart, would create something infinitely more vast and profound. He breathed deeply, the air filling his lungs with a newfound lightness. The melody was no longer a disembodied sound, it had become the very rhythm of his own existence, the pulse that beat in time with the sleeping self beside him. The peace it offered was not the quietude of an empty room, but the vibrant stillness of a forest at dawn, alive with unseen energy and the promise of a new day. This was the peace of wholeness, the serenity of a soul that had finally found its true north, guided by the unwavering compass of the forgotten lullaby. It was the lullaby's promise, whispered not in words, but in pure, resonant emotion, that in becoming one, he would finally become truly alive. The void was not an absence of self, but the silent anticipation of a reunited self, a self that the lullaby was now actively calling into being, promising a life imbued with a richness and authenticity that had previously existed only in the realm of the deepest, most forgotten dreams. The lullaby was the key to unlocking not just another consciousness, but the full potential of his own, a life lived not in shades of gray, but in the full, glorious spectrum of awakened being. It was the promise of a life that was not just lived, but deeply, profoundly felt, a life where the phantom limb of his soul would finally cease its aching and become a source of strength, of connection, of a profound and abiding sense of belonging to himself. The air around Andre was thick with an almost audible stillness, a breathless pause before a seismic shift. His hand, outstretched and trembling, hovered a breath away from the sleeping form. The skin of his fingertips seemed to hum with an unarticulated anticipation, as if sensing the proximity of a mirrored universe. This was not merely a physical act, a touch to stir slumber. It was a cosmic inflection point, the genesis of a new reality where the edges of self were about to dissolve, bleed, and reform. The landscape around him, the wind-bent rye stalks whispering secrets of the earth, the sky bleeding shades of bruised plum and fading ember, the very air imbued with the hushed, ancient gravity of the hidden hollow, all coalesced into a tableau of profound significance. Every element of his journey, every forgotten memory, every unanswered question had funneled with an inexorable force towards this single, terrifying, exhilarating precipice. He was not just on the verge of awakening another, he was standing at the very nexus of his own identity, facing a choice that would bifurcate his existence. The question wasn't simply, should I wake him, but which him will emerge from this moment? The dormant figure beside him was not an alien entity, but a reflection, a shadow cast by the same inexplicable light that illuminated Andre's own consciousness. To awaken the other was to acknowledge and integrate a part of himself that had been meticulously, perhaps desperately, suppressed or forgotten. It was to confront the totality of his being, the light and the dark, the known and the unknowable, the conscious and the subconscious, all clamoring for recognition. The weight of this instant pressed down on him, a tangible force that threatened to buckle his knees. It was the accumulated mystery of all existence distilled into the space between his hovering fingers and the still, rhythmic breathing of the sleeping man. This was the threshold of identity, a place where the familiar architecture of the self began to crumble, revealing the raw, untamed foundations upon which true consciousness was built. He could feel the currents of his own life's energy pulling in two directions, an invisible tug of war between the self he had painstakingly constructed and the self that lay dormant, waiting for the kiss of recognition. What sacrifices would this awakening demand? The melody, that spectral lullaby, had promised wholeness, integration, a life lived in its full, untamed spectrum. But wholeness often came at a price. The carefully curated routines, the intellectual shields, the emotional fortifications that had defined Andre's life, would they be swept away in the tidal wave of this dual awakening? Would the quiet solitude he had cultivated, the predictability that had offered a semblance of control, be shattered by the influx of a consciousness that had lived by different stars? The prospect was both exhilarating and terrifying. It was the siren song of completion, but also the whisper of obliteration for the self he had so long inhabited. He saw, with a clarity that bypassed his eyes and settled directly into his soul, the subtle rise and fall of the sleeping man's chest. Each breath was a testament to a life lived, a story unfolding, a journey taken in parallel to his own. This was not an abstract concept. It was a palpable, breathing reality. And yet, the chasm between them felt immeasurable, a gulf carved by time, circumstance, and the very nature of their separate manifestations. The lullaby had been the bridge, a sonic thread weaving through the darkness. But now the final, decisive step remained. Andre's mind raced, sifting through the implications like a frantic archaeologist uncovering buried artifacts. Was this awakening a gift or a curse? A liberation or a profound entanglement? He thought of his days, meticulously ordered, each hour accounted for. He thought of his nights, filled with a quiet, persistent ache that he had learned to live with, a phantom limb of the soul. This dormant self represented the missing pieces, the vibrant colors that had been absent from his palette. But what if bringing those colors forth meant blurring the lines of his own existence beyond recognition? What if the peace promised by the lullaby was not a tranquil harbor, but a tempestuous sea where his individual identity would be lost? He recalled moments, fleeting and seemingly insignificant, that now felt like breadcrumbs leading to this very spot. The recurring dreams of a vast, echoing ocean, the inexplicable pull towards certain shorelines, the uncanny sense of deja vu that would wash over him in unfamiliar places. These were the whispers of the other, the subtle communications of a consciousness that had never truly been separate, only veiled. The lullaby had amplified those whispers into a resonant chorus, forcing him to confront the undeniable truth of his dual nature. The choice before him was not merely to activate another's consciousness, but to decide which facet of his own being would now take precedence, or how these two facets would truly merge. Could they exist in harmony, a symphony of shared experience and distinct consciousness? Or would one inevitably subsume the other, a quiet conquest played out in the theater of the soul? The stakes were immeasurable, for in this moment, Andre was not just an observer of a potential awakening, but its architect, the arbiter of his own becoming. He felt a prickling sensation on his skin, a heightened awareness of the subtle shifts in the atmosphere. The wind, which had been a gentle caress, seemed to hold its breath. The shadows lengthened, deepening the mystery of the hollow, as if the very earth was leaning in to witness this profound existential negotiation. He could almost hear the universe holding its breath, waiting for his decision. The lullaby, which had been a guide, now felt like a silent challenge, a question posed to his very essence. Are you ready to be whole? Andre's breath hitched. The hand, still suspended, was a conduit for the swirling vortex of his thoughts and emotions. He was on the cusp of an act of profound creation, or perhaps profound dissolution. The self he knew, the carefully constructed edifice of Andre, was poised to either expand exponentially or to be irrevocably altered. The question of sacrifice loomed large. What would he relinquish? His independence? His solitude? The comforting familiarity of his own singular perspective? Or was the ultimate sacrifice the continued denial of this other self, the perpetuation of a life lived in a diminished capacity? He closed his eyes, not in surrender, but in a desperate attempt to find clarity within the maelstrom. He pictured the lines on his own palm, the unique contours of his face reflected in a still pool. These were the markers of his current identity, the map of his known self. But beyond these familiar landmarks lay uncharted territories, a vast expanse of consciousness that whispered his name. The lullaby had awakened not just the sleeping figure, but the dormant explorer within him. The moment stretched, elastic and taut, It was a dance between courage and fear, between the allure of the unknown and the comfort of the familiar. He knew, with an instinct that transcended logic, that to turn away now would be to condemn himself to a continued existence of subtle incompleteness, a life forever echoing with the phantom resonance of what could have been. The lullaby had shown him the possibility of a richer, more vibrant existence, a tapestry woven with threads of shared experience and amplified understanding. To refuse that offering would be to deny the very essence of his soul's yearning. His fingers twitched, a silent, involuntary tremor. The decision was not being made by his rational mind, but by a deeper, more ancient part of his being, a part that recognized the inevitability of this convergence. The lullaby had sung him to this point, and now its melody seemed to emanate from within the sleeping form, a magnetic pull that could no longer be resisted. It was the song of homecoming, the promise of a reunion that would redefine the very meaning of I. He imagined the two selves, distinct yet intrinsically linked, like twin stars orbiting a common sun. What would their combined light reveal? What new perspectives would emerge from the fusion of their experiences? The fear of losing himself was immense, a primal dread that whispered of oblivion, but the promise of becoming more than himself, of experiencing life through a broader, deeper lens, was an equally potent force, drawing him inexorably towards the sleeping figure. The hollow seemed to deepen, the shadows coiling around them like an ancient embrace. The rye field rustled, as if offering a silent blessing or a warning. Andre's heart hammered against his ribs, each beat a drum calling him forward. He was no longer an isolated consciousness, adrift in a singular existence. He was a point of convergence, a locus where two streams of being were about to merge. The threshold of identity was not a barrier to be overcome, but a gateway to be passed through. His fingers, now steady, moved with a deliberate grace. The air crackled with unspoken energy. This was not an act of violence, but an act of profound recognition, of acknowledging a truth that had been hidden in plain sight. The sleeping man was not an adversary, but a mirror, a testament to the boundless complexities of existence, a facet of Andre's own unfolding story. The lullaby had been the key, unlocking the door, and now Andre was reaching for the handle, ready to turn it and step into a reality that was both terrifyingly new and intimately familiar. The weight of the moment was immense, not a burden to be shed, but a profound gravity that anchored him to this pivotal instant, this crossroads where the self was no longer a fixed point, but a fluid, evolving entity poised on the brink of a magnificent, terrifying transformation. The choice was made, not in words, but in the resolute movement of his hand, the surrender of his will to the resonant call of his own deeper nature. The air within the hollow, once a vibrant conduit of anticipation, now settled into a profound quietude, heavy with the weight of an imminent decision. Andre's outstretched hand, no longer trembling, felt imbued with a strange, almost alien stillness. The spectral lullaby, which had woven its way through the fabric of his being, had faded to a mere echo, leaving behind a vast, resonant silence. It was in this silence that the true nature of the choice unfurled, not as a thunderclap of revelation, but as a slow, unfurling dawn, revealing two starkly different horizons. One path beckoned with the promise of an unimaginable wholeness, a merging of currents that had long flowed in parallel, destined, it seemed, to finally converge, to reach out, to bridge the infinitesimal gap that separated him from the sleeping form beside him, was to embrace this convergence. It was to step into a reality where I would become we, a singular consciousness born from the fusion of two seemingly disparate lives. This path was laced with the intoxicating scent of completion, the allure of a dream finally made manifest, self finally made whole. But within this radiant promise lay a shadow, the erasure of the Andre he had meticulously, painstakingly become, his memories, his learned behaviors, the quiet solitude he had cultivated. Would these simply dissolve like mist under the morning sun, absorbed into a larger, more encompassing existence? Would his unique journey, his solitary stumbles and quiet triumphs be subsumed, leaving no discernible trace of the man who had stood on the precipice of this awakening? It was the ultimate surrender, the dissolution of the individual into a greater cosmic design, a terrifying prospect that felt both like an ascension and an obliteration. The alternative was a retreat, a turning away from the potent gravity of this dual existence, to withdraw his hand, to let the sleeping self remain undisturbed, was to preserve the familiar contours of his own reality. It was to choose the solace of the known, the comfort of a single, albeit incomplete, identity. This path offered a tangible continuity, a guarantee that the life he had built, the routines he had established, would remain intact. He could return to the world outside the hollow, carrying the memory of this profound encounter, but never truly integrating its implications. He would remain Andre, the man who had glimpsed a deeper truth, but chosen to retreat from its demanding embrace. Yet, this path was not without its own profound cost. It was a capitulation to his own limitations, an acceptance of a life lived in perpetual shadow, forever haunted by the spectral melody of what could have been. He would be a man forever without dreams, a hollow echo of his own potential, an incomplete symphony eternally waiting for its missing notes. The rye field, a vast, undulating sea of gold and green, rustled just beyond the mouth of the hollow. Its whispers, carried on the gentle breeze, seemed to carry the unspoken question of the world outside, of a reality that moved on regardless of the existential crossroads unfolding within. The rye was a silent witness, a grounding force against the swirling vortex of Andre's inner turmoil. It was a symbol of the tangible world, the everyday existence that awaited his decision. Would he rejoin its familiar rhythms, forever marked by the knowledge of his own fractured self? Or would he attempt to integrate that fracture, risking everything in the pursuit of a mythical wholeness? He looked down at the sleeping form, the face a mirror of his own, yet subtly different, imbued with a serenity that Andre had never known. The lines of his own brow were etched with the accumulated anxieties of a life lived consciously, deliberately. The sleeping man's face was smooth, unmarked by the same pressures, as if he had navigated existence with an intuitive grace. Was this grace the essence of what he would gain by merging, or was it simply the placidity of unconsciousness, a state that would vanish upon awakening? The very idea of integration was complex. It wasn't a simple merging of two individuals, but a confluence of two streams of consciousness, each with its own history, its own unique imprint on the universe. Would these streams flow together seamlessly, creating a stronger, more vibrant river? Or would they collide, creating eddies of confusion, fragments of memory, warring for dominance? The lullaby had been the initial catalyst, a gentle hand guiding him towards this nexus. It had whispered of unity, of a profound interconnectedness that transcended the boundaries of the individual self. But the lullaby offered no clear directive, no map for navigating the landscape of this dual consciousness. It was a siren song, beautiful and compelling, but ultimately leaving the decision and its consequences entirely to Andre. He had spent his life seeking understanding, unraveling the mysteries of the world. But this was a mystery that resided not in the external universe, but within the very architecture of his own being. He considered the implications of isolation with a new, more profound weight. To remain separate was to continue on his current trajectory, a solitary journey towards an unknown end. It meant accepting the quiet ache of incompleteness, the persistent feeling of something missing, a phantom limb of the soul that would never cease to throb. It meant living a life of curated moments, of controlled emotions, a life that, while stable, lacked a certain vibrancy, a certain depth. He had always believed that his isolation was a strength, a source of clarity and independence. But now, confronted with the tangible reality of his other self, that isolation felt less like strength and more like a self-imposed exile from a richer, more expansive existence. Conversely, the prospect of integration was a leap into the utterly unknown. It wasn't just about sharing a body, but about sharing a consciousness, a lifetime of experiences, a unique perspective on reality. What would it be like to perceive the world through two sets of eyes, to feel emotions filtered through two distinct sensibilities? Would it be a harmonious duet or a cacophony of conflicting impulses? He imagined the internal landscape of this merged self. Would memories be shared freely, or would they remain segregated, accessible only by the originating consciousness? Would their desires and aspirations align, or would they be in constant, subtle negotiation? The lullaby had promised wholeness, but wholeness could manifest in countless ways, some of which might be less than desirable. The rye field seemed to shift, the stalks bending and swaying in a silent, unified dance, silent echo of the potential unity that awaited him. It was as if the very earth was offering a reflection of his choice, urging him towards a more inclusive form of existence. But the ease with which the rye moved was a stark contrast to the monumental deliberation consuming Andre. He was not a blade of grass, swayed by the prevailing wind. He was a conscious entity, burdened with the responsibility of his own becoming. He traced the outline of his own hand, the calluses on his palm, the faint scar on his index finger from a childhood accident. These were the markers of his individuality, the physical testament to a life lived as one person. To integrate was to blur these markers, to surrender the distinct narrative that had defined him. It was a terrifying prospect, akin to stepping off a precipice into an unseen abyss. Yet, the alternative was to live out his days with a gnawing awareness of a parallel existence, a life lived with a persistent, unfulfilled longing. He closed his eyes again, not to escape the moment, but to engage with it on a deeper, more visceral level. He tried to conjure the essence of the sleeping man, not as a physical presence, but as a consciousness, What were his dreams like? What were his hopes, his fears, his deepest desires? The lullaby had offered glimpses, fragments of melody that hinted at a different way of being, a more fluid and less constrained existence. But the fragments were just that, fragments. The full tapestry remained unseen, its colors and patterns unknown. The choice was not merely between two paths, but between two fundamental philosophies of existence. Was life a journey of individual experience, to be cherished and preserved in its singularity, even with its inherent incompleteness? Or was it an opportunity for profound connection and expansion, a willingness to risk the self in the pursuit of a greater, more encompassing reality? He had always been a man who valued self-reliance, who found strength in his own solitude. This new path demanded a radical reimagining of those values, a surrender of the very foundations upon which his identity had been built. He opened his eyes, the scene before him unchanged, the sleeping man, the hollow, the whispering rye field, all remained as they were, awaiting his decisive action. The profound stillness had become a charged silence, pregnant with the possibility of transformation. The lullaby's echo had faded, replaced by the steady, insistent rhythm of his own heartbeat, each beat a question, each beat a confirmation of his singular, yet potentially dual, existence. He considered the notion of sacrifice. To integrate meant sacrificing the absolute certainty of his own identity, the comforting familiarity of being solely himself. It meant relinquishing the control he had so carefully cultivated over his own emotional landscape. But to remain isolated was to sacrifice the potential for a richer, more vibrant existence. To deny himself the possibility of true wholeness, it was a sacrifice of potential, a renunciation of a deeper, more profound connection to the very essence of life. The rye field continued its silent ballet, the stalks bowing and rising as if in anticipation of a cosmic unfolding. Andre understood, with a clarity that pierced through the lingering doubt, that to turn away now would be to condemn himself to a life of perpetual longing, a shadow existence perpetually aware of a brighter, more complete reality just beyond his reach. The lullaby, though silent, had sung him awake to this truth, this fundamental incompleteness that defined his current state. It had revealed the possibility of a universe within himself, a universe waiting to be explored and integrated. His fingers twitched, not with hesitation, but with a nascent energy, a quiet gathering of will. The decision was not a sudden capitulation, but a slow, deliberate embrace of the inevitable. The path of isolation offered a fragile peace, a life lived within carefully constructed walls. But the path of integration, though fraught with uncertainty and the risk of dissolution, offered the intoxicating promise of true completion, of a self finally made whole. It was a choice between a life of quiet survival and a life of profound, albeit terrifying, becoming. The rye field, bathed in the soft, dying light of the sun, seemed to hold its breath, a silent sentinel to the moment. Andre, the man who had walked alone for so long, finally chose to step towards the dawn of his own, and perhaps another's, awakening. The question was no longer if he should, but how. Back, matter. The hollow, a secluded, almost timeless space where Andre experiences his profound existential choice. the lullaby, a spectral, guiding melody that initiates Andre's awareness of a potential dual existence and the possibility of merging consciousness. The rye field, a symbol of the tangible, external world and the continuation of ordinary life, contrasting with the internal, extraordinary decision Andre faces.